Evening lads, Mason here. Welcome back to the Fall Asleep podcast, your quiet place for haunted histories, forgotten folklore, and the strange moments when the past seems unwilling to remain where it belongs. Tonight we are travelling to Berkshire, to a town beside the River Thames, where narrow streets climb towards the walls of the oldest occupied castle in the world. For nearly 1,000 years, Windsor Castle has stood above the river. Kings have been born there, queens have waited there for news of war. Prisoners have been held behind its walls, royal bodies have been carried through its gates and lowered beneath the floor of its chapel. Generations of soldiers have guarded its towers, courtyards and private rooms, and long after the visitors have gone home, some of those guards have heard footsteps moving through passages that should have been empty. Heavy footsteps, unevenly placed, followed by the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. There are stories of a woman dressed in black standing at the far end of a room, watching in silence before turning away. There are accounts of a king appearing at an upper window after the apartments behind it have been checked and locked. There are old tales of doors opening without a hand upon them, voices speaking from darkened chambers, and a wounded man breathing heavily as he moves through the castle towards the chapel where his body has lain since 1547. Now settle in and let's begin. In the beautiful countryside of the English Cotswolds, there stands an old inn that people have travelled from around the world to visit. Many have spent the night beneath its crooked beams. Some have heard children crying in empty rooms. Others have been scratched, touched, and physically assaulted by presences they described as demonic. The owner, John Humphreys, lived inside the building for nearly 50 years. He claimed that invisible hands dragged him from his bed, that predatory spirits entered his room at night, and that something inside the inn repeatedly attacked him while he slept. Beneath the floors, he discovered what he believed were child remains, and according to local legend, the ground itself had once been used for ancient rituals and offerings. The building still stands today. The ancient Ram Inn is said to be home to more than 20 spirits, including entities believed to be violent, provocative, and inhuman. Would you dare to spend a night inside? Check in to the ancient Ram Inn exclusively on the Fall Asleep podcast Patreon. Click the Patreon link in the description below to listen to the full case. This case is the latest addition to our growing library of Patreon exclusive episodes, joining The Demon in the French Kingdom, Rumpelstiltskin, The Devils of Loudun, and The Exorcism at St. Joseph's Convent. Head over to Patreon today to unlock the complete archive of 90 plus episodes, ad-free listening, and early access to every new release. The Fall Asleep podcast on Patreon is your Netflix for scary podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well. Now back to the video.
I've been expecting you. You're listening to the Fall Asleep podcast.
Beyond the walls, the stories become darker still. Windsor Great Park stretches south from the castle through open grassland, old avenues and deep woods. Deer move beneath ancient trees there, just as they did when Tudor kings rode out to hunt. Somewhere in that landscape, according to a legend already old enough for Shakespeare to place it on the stage, a horned huntsman walks around an oak at midnight. Chains move with him through the winter darkness. Trees wither after his passing. Cattle panic in their fields. Those who hear the hunt approaching are advised to leave the path before the rider reaches them. Yet Windsor does not first present itself as a place of horror. Approached in daylight, it appears measured, dignified, and almost reassuring. The Thames bends quietly through the town. Swans gather near the banks. Trains arrive from London and empty their passengers into streets lined with brick, stone, and painted shop fronts. The castle rises above all of it, its walls following the high ground, its towers visible between rooftops, its flag moving against the English sky. There is something deeply familiar in the sight, even for people who have never stood there before. Windsor belongs to the public imagination. It appears in royal weddings, state visits, wartime photographs, and funeral processions. It has watched generations of schoolchildren pass beneath its walls and generations of soldiers march through its gates. Its image carries the calm authority of something that has endured far longer than any person looking up at it. The town has grown around the castle, but never quite over it. Streets rise towards the walls as though drawn there. Houses, hotels, and public buildings gather close beneath the battlements, while the round tower remains above them all, holding the eye from almost every direction. In winter, a pale mist can sit over the river, while the castle catches the first weak light. On summer evenings, the stone turns warm above the crowded streets, and the sound of bells carries beyond the roofs. During rain, the walls darken, and the pavements shine beneath them. At night, when the town becomes quieter, Windsor Castle is lit from below, and seems to float above the river valley, immense and watchful. It is easy to understand why a place like this inspires pride. The castle has survived conquest, rebellion, plague, civil war, political disgrace, 2 world wars, family tragedy, and fire. It has changed with the country while remaining recognizably itself. Stone has replaced timber, rooms have been rebuilt, towers altered, windows widened, roofs raised, and interiors remade, according to the taste of different reigns, yet the central shape remains. The castle still stands where William the Conqueror placed his first fortress in the years after 1066, guarding the western approach to London and the river below. The first Windsor would have looked very different from the royal residence seen today. There were no polished state apartments, no long galleries of paintings, no Gothic chapel filled with carved stone and coloured glass. The earliest fortress was built from earth and timber. Men worked in mud beneath rough palisades. Horses stamped inside crowded enclosures. Smoke clung beneath wooden roofs. At night, guards stood above the walls and stared towards a forest that seemed to begin where the settlement ended. Those first centuries would have known darkness in a form difficult to recover now. There were few lights beyond the fortification, and no glow of London across the horizon. The Thames reflected only the moon when the clouds allowed it. Wolves still survived in England. Outlaws and displaced men moved through the countryside. A snapped branch beyond the ditch could mean an animal, a stranger, or an attack. Windsor began as a place where men listened carefully after dark. That habit never entirely left it. Centuries later, the soldiers at Windsor wear different uniforms and guard a palace rather than a timber stronghold, but they remain trained to observe. Ceremony surrounds them, and visitors often see only the surface of that duty. They watch red tunics beneath bearskin caps. They hear commands ring across a courtyard. They raise phones as polished boots strike the stone in exact rhythm. For the guard, the experience is different. A sentry learns the ground, the expected movements, the proper doors, the ordinary noises, and the hours when those noises should cease. Familiarity becomes part of security. A sound that means nothing to a visitor may become important to the person who knows that nobody is meant to be walking in that passage. One of the oldest kinds of story told at Windsor begins with a guard hearing someone approach. The account changes depending on who tells it. In some versions, the soldier is inside the castle. In others, he is stationed close to one of the royal apartments. The hour varies, as does the exact passage, but the sound remains much the same. A foot comes down heavily upon the floor. There is a pause longer than an ordinary stride. Then comes a dragging movement, followed by another heavy step. The guard listens. He expects a member of staff, another soldier, or someone from the household. The building is never completely empty, and people move through it at hours when the public is gone. Yet the rhythm is unusual enough to hold his attention. The tread continues. One foot lands with force. The other seems to follow reluctantly, scraping across the floorboards or stone. Between each pair of movements there is breathing, slow and burdened, as though the person approaching is carrying great weight or suffering considerable pain. The guard looks towards the turn in the corridor. The sound grows louder, it comes steadily closer, reaches the corner and stops. Nothing appears. The soldier waits, expecting a face to show itself or a hand to touch the wall. The passage beyond the corner is dark, though not entirely so. There is enough light to see that nobody stands there. Then the breathing begins again. It is now on the same side of the corner as the guard. A heavy foot strikes the floor, followed by the dragging leg. The sound passes him without a visible body, and continues along the passage towards St. George's Chapel. The man said to walk in that manner is Henry VIII. His grave lies beneath the floor of the chapel within the castle grounds, marked by a simple slab far smaller than the monument he once intended for himself. During the final years of his life, Henry was afflicted by severe ulcers in his legs, restricted movement, great weight, and chronic pain. He had once been celebrated for his physical strength, his riding, his dancing, and his command of the court. By the end, walking had become difficult, and the arrival of the king could be heard through the laboured movement of a body that no longer obeyed him. Windsor remembers that sound. Generations of staff, visitors, and storytellers have carried that belief through Windsor. Windsor has its familiar nocturnal language. Timber settles, air passes through chimneys, hidden pipes answer one another, and wind worries at windows high above the town. The people who work there learn every harmless creak and distant pulse until the castle becomes as recognizable by sound as by sight. Those familiar noises never walk the length of a corridor, pause at a doorway, and breathe beside a guard before limping away. The tread attributed to Henry carries intention, pain, and the dreadful sense of somebody choosing a route through the dark. By day, such stories seem far from the polished life of Windsor. Visitors enter through controlled routes. They pass beneath stone arches, across courtyards and into rooms. Paintings hang beneath high ceilings. Armor stands beneath banners. Furniture remains where generations have admired it. The air carries the quiet murmur of people being reminded to move forward, look upwards, and remain behind the rope. Some rooms are so richly decorated that the eye struggles to settle. Gold catches the light, carved wood rises around doorways, tall windows overlook the grounds. Portraits of kings, queens, generals, and courtiers watch from the walls, many painted at the height of their power, before illness, age, or violence reduced them to bodies carried through the castle gates. The public route gives an impression of order. Every object has a label, every doorway a purpose, every room a history that can be told within a few measured minutes. Behind that route lies a far larger working place. Windsor contains offices, private apartments, service corridors, stairways, storage rooms, guard posts, chapels, basements, kitchens, and chambers that most visitors will never see. Staff arrive before the doors open and remain after they close. Floors are cleaned, objects checked, rooms prepared, and practical work completed beneath ceilings built for kings. The castle changes when the last visitors leave. It does not happen all at once. Crowds thin gradually, voices fade from the larger rooms, footsteps move towards the exits. A final family pauses beside a window before being gently directed onward. Doors close behind them. Staff begin the routines that return the palace from public display to private residence. The silence enters room by room. In a crowded gallery, an unexplained sound can disappear among hundreds of others. After closing, one faint knock may travel the length of the walls. A floorboard moving in an adjoining chamber can make a person stop and listen. A voice spoken far away may reach a staircase without revealing where it began. There are stories of workers hearing movement in rooms they had just checked. A door stands open after being closed. A light appears beneath it, though the room beyond is dark. A woman crosses the far end of a gallery and turns through an entrance that has been sealed for years. A child laughs somewhere beyond the public apartments, and the sound stops when the witness reaches the place where it seemed to be. Such accounts usually arrive with the restraint expected inside a royal residence. People describe a door, a voice, or a passing figure in careful language, often after trying every key, room, and ordinary movement that might explain it. Their work requires calm judgment, and the fear becomes stronger when that judgment finds nothing living at the end of the passage. A guard who hears footsteps may simply mention that someone was in a passage. A member of staff who sees a figure may ask whether a colleague was wearing dark clothing. Only after the answers fail does the incident begin to take another shape. This restraint gives Windsor's ghost stories much of their power. The witnesses are not entering a ruin with torches and recording equipment. They are doing their jobs inside one of the most carefully maintained buildings in Britain. They expect doors to be secure, rooms to be checked, and movements to have an explanation. When something impossible happens, the castle does not stop around them. The guard remains at his post, the staff member completes the round, the light is switched off again. The door is locked, morning arrives, and visitors return to the room where a woman disappeared the night before. Among the figures most often reported inside Windsor is a woman dressed in black. She is associated with Elizabeth I, who knew the castle in life and whose reign gave England some of its strongest images of royal authority. The Elizabeth remembered in portraits is composed, pale, and elaborately dressed, her body nearly hidden beneath embroidered cloth, jewels, and stiffened fabric. Her image was carefully made. Age, fear, and private weakness were pushed behind the public face of a queen who had survived plots, religious division, rebellion, and threats from abroad. The apparition at Windsor carries something of that control. She is rarely described as rushing, crying, or calling for help. She stands at a distance. She is seen in a room where nobody expected to find her, sometimes in black, sometimes in a gown belonging to another age. Witnesses notice the certainty of her posture before they understand that anything is wrong. One account begins with a person entering a room and seeing a woman at the far end. There is enough light to make out her clothing and the pale shape of her face. She does not seem transparent. She appears as real as anyone else in the castle, though strangely still, with the weight of her dress falling towards the floor. The witness assumes she has entered by mistake or belongs to the household. A word is spoken to her. The woman turns, her heels strike the floor with sharp, measured taps as she moves towards the doorway. The witness follows, perhaps embarrassed at having disturbed her, perhaps already uneasy because the clothing is wrong. The woman passes around the corner. When the witness reaches it, the next passage is empty. There is nowhere for her to have gone. No open door, no stairway, no hidden recess large enough to conceal a person in such a gown. The witness stands listening, waiting for the heels to continue farther ahead. They resume behind him. 2 quiet steps cross the room he has just left. When he turns, the room is empty. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace in 1603 and was buried at Westminster Abbey. Yet Windsor has long recognized the woman in black as the Queen returning to a castle she knew intimately. Her bearing, clothing, and cold authority belong to Elizabeth, and the figure carries herself like someone who still expects every room to open before her. The sound of her heels appears in several versions of the story. At times, only the footsteps are heard. They cross a room, pause, and continue through a closed door. On other occasions, the woman is seen near windows, or at the edge of a passage, watching those who have entered her space. There is a coldness in that kind of haunting that differs from the wounded tread attributed to Henry VIII. Henry announces suffering. The woman in black suggests possession. She walks through Windsor as though the years since her death are an inconvenience that concerns other people. The castle encourages such thoughts because the dead remain physically close. Within its walls stands St. George's Chapel, one of the finest surviving works of late medieval English architecture and the resting place of 11 monarchs. The building rises in pale stone above the lower ward, its windows and pinnacles visible from outside the castle. Visitors enter beneath carved details and lift their eyes towards the fan-vaulted ceiling, where stone spreads overhead with the delicacy of lace. The chapel remains a living place of worship. Prayers are spoken there, music fills the choir. Members of the Order of the Garter gather beneath banners and carved stalls. Royal weddings and funerals have passed through its doors before the eyes of the world. Beneath the beauty lies an extraordinary concentration of the dead. Edward IV is buried there. Henry VI was brought there after death. Henry VIII lies beside Jane Seymour. Charles I was placed in the same vault after his execution. George III and members of his family rest within the royal vault. George V, Queen Mary, George VI, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, Prince Philip, and Queen Elizabeth II are among those buried within the chapel or its connected memorial spaces. A visitor can stand above the remains of kings whose reigns are taught as distant history, and hear an ordinary service continue around them. At night, the chapel becomes harder to separate from the dead it contains. The light leaves the coloured windows, details high in the stone disappear, banners hang without movement, the stalls remain empty. Below the floor, coffins occupy spaces few people will ever see. There is a particular discomfort in burial beneath an occupied castle. The dead are not in a cemetery beyond the town. They remain at the center of royal life. Soldiers pass close to them. Staff work above them. Bells sound over them. Families gather within yards of their graves. The separation between residence and tomb is only a matter of stone. Henry VIII's burial there was not meant to be modest. He planned a magnificent monument, larger and richer than the slab that marks his resting place now. Designs involved marble, bronze, statues, columns, and elaborate decoration. The work was never completed. The king, who had controlled the burial places of others, broken monasteries, and remade the religious life of his kingdom, was left without the great tomb he expected. The unfinished quality of that burial has long fed the imagination. Perhaps the heavy footsteps belong to a king seeking the monument that was never built. Perhaps he moves towards the chapel because some part of him remains angered by the plain stone above his body. Perhaps the sound is only the castle settling around the memory of a man whose final years made every step painful. Whatever the cause, those footsteps are the best-known terror within Windsor. To understand why, it helps to remember the man before the limp. Henry came to the throne in 1509 as a young king admired for his appearance, education, and physical ability. He rode, hunted, danced, played music, and took part in tournaments. He was tall for his time, confident and eager to embody the strength expected of a warrior prince. At Windsor he attended ceremonies, entertained courtiers, and used the surrounding forest for hunting. The castle suited the image he wished to project, ancient, martial, and royal. The chapel was completed during his reign and became one of the great physical statements of Tudor kingship. Stone rose into intricate vaulting, light entered through tall windows, the banners and rituals of the Order of the Garter tied Henry to a tradition older than his own dynasty. He moved through these spaces as a man who expected history to remember him magnificently. His body began to betray that expectation. A serious injury during a tournament in 1536 worsened problems with his legs. Ulcers opened and refused to heal. Treatments were painful and limited. The wounds could close and then become dangerous when pressure and infection built beneath the skin. They were reopened to allow drainage. Accounts from the period describe concern about fever and the king's condition. As his movement became restricted, his weight increased, placing further strain upon his legs. The physical world around Henry changed. Rooms that had once welcomed an athletic king had to accommodate a man who found walking difficult. Devices were used to move him. Servants attended more closely. Hunting and exercise became harder. The smell from infected wounds may have followed him. Pain became part of the royal presence. Those around Henry could not simply react as they would to another sick man. He remained the king, capable of rewarding, ruining, or killing those who displeased him. Physicians treated a body upon which their own safety depended. Courtiers watched his mood. Servants heard him approaching and prepared themselves. The sound would have come first. A heavy step, then the damaged leg. A pause while the king gathered himself, breathing sharpened by effort, the floor answering beneath his weight. Henry died at Whitehall in January 1547. His body was prepared and carried towards Windsor for burial. The funeral journey took days. At Sion, where the coffin rested overnight, later legend claimed that foul liquid leaked from it, and a dog licked beneath the casket, fulfilling words once spoken against the king. The image survived because Henry's ruined body had already become a symbol of corruption, judgment, and a reign ending in physical horror. When the procession reached Windsor, the king entered the castle for the last time inside a coffin. He was lowered into the vault beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him the son he desired and then died shortly after childbirth. Above them, the chapel continued towards completion. The great monument remained a promise. Centuries passed, the Tudors gave way to the Stuarts to other dynasties. Windsor changed around the grave. Floors were repaired, rooms redecorated, windows replaced, and galleries transformed. The king beneath the chapel became history. Yet in the hours after closing, someone still seems to remember the weight of his final body. Imagine a winter night within the castle, long after midnight, when the wind is moving around the towers and the town below has gone quiet. A guard stands beneath a covered passage. The light is low, enough to hold the shape of the walls, but not enough to soften them. He has been there long enough to know every ordinary sound within reach. From somewhere beyond the next doorway comes a slow impact. He turns his head, another follows. There is no conversation, no radio, no second pair of steps. Only one person is moving, and that person is moving badly. The sound approaches through the passage. The guard looks towards the doorway and waits for a colleague to emerge. Instead, a shadow crosses the floor before the opening, though nothing interrupts the light. The breathing begins. It is deep, wet, and exhausted. The person beyond the doorway seems to be forcing air through a chest compressed by enormous weight. There is a pause, then a faint scrape as the injured foot is pulled forward. The guard may call out. No answer returns. The heavy step lands again. The sound enters the passage without a visible source. For a few seconds, it moves directly towards him. The air carries a smell of old cloth, sweat, and something sweetly rotten beneath it. The guard feels the instinct to step aside before understanding why. He does so. The footsteps pass. At the point where a body should be level with him, the breathing becomes close enough to touch. A faint pressure moves through the air. The guard sees nothing, but the skin along his arms tightens as though a large person has brushed by. The tread continues behind him. He turns and watches an empty passage receive each step. One floorboard answers under a weight that cannot be seen. Then another. The scrape follows. The unseen walker reaches the end of the passage and turns towards the chapel. The guard hears him descend. After that, silence returns so completely that the soldier can hear his own breath. This is the terror of Windsor at its strongest. The dead do not always appear as pale figures floating beneath sheets of moonlight. Sometimes the castle offers only the physical signs of a person who has been dead for nearly 500 years. Weight upon a floor, breath in the dark, pain carried from one step into the next. The witness does not need to see Henry VIII. The body can be understood from the way it moves. Not every presence at Windsor carries such violence. Some are quieter, and the quiet ones can remain with a witness for longer. George III is said to appear near the rooms and windows associated with his final years. His ghost belongs to another kind of suffering, less physical in the stories told about him, though no less terrible. He had known Windsor as a family home. He and Queen Charlotte spent long periods there, and the castle became closely tied to their domestic life. Their children filled its rooms. Music, lessons, meals, and court business continued beneath the old towers. George took a deep interest in farming, science, and the practical affairs of his kingdom. He could be warm, diligent, and personally conscientious, though his reign was also marked by political crisis, war, and the loss of the American colonies. Then came the periods when his mind failed him. The king suffered episodes of severe disturbance during which his speech accelerated, his behavior changed, and those around him struggled to manage a condition they did not understand. Physicians employed treatments that could be harsh, humiliating, and frightening. He was restrained. Access to him was controlled. His words were observed and recorded because his condition affected the government of the country. Within Windsor, a royal household became a place of anxiety. A servant approaching the king's room might hear his voice long before the door opened. Family members waited for signs of improvement. Doctors argued. Politicians watched from London. Every private moment of illness carried public consequence. In later life, George became blind and increasingly withdrawn from the world. He lived through the death of his beloved daughter Amelia, and reportedly spoke of her after she was gone. His final years passed in confinement at Windsor, while the Prince Regent exercised royal authority. He died there in January 1820. The ghost associated with him is often seen at a window. A soldier crossing a courtyard at night looks upwards and notices a man standing behind the glass. The room is dark, yet the figure is lighter than the space around it. His head is bowed. One hand rests against the pane. The guard assumes that a member of the household has entered the room and continues walking. Then something about the figure makes him stop. The clothing belongs to another period. The hair falls differently around the face. The man is not looking out across the grounds. He seems to be staring at something close to the window, perhaps his own reflection, perhaps something standing in the room with him. The guard watches. The figure lifts its head. For a moment the face is visible. It appears old, pale, and deeply troubled. The mouth moves. The glass prevents the words from being heard. yet the man seems to repeat the same thing again and again. A light is requested inside the room. Someone goes to check. The door remains locked. When it is opened, the chamber is empty. The curtains hang still. The window is secured from within. Dust on the inner ledge shows no recent touch. Outside, the guard looks up again. The man has gone. Another version places the encounter inside. A member of staff hears a male voice beyond a closed door. The words do not form a conversation. The voice runs on rapidly, breaking and starting again, as though the speaker cannot prevent the words from coming. The witness waits, reluctant to interrupt someone who may belong in the room. Then the tone changes. The voice becomes pleading. A name is repeated, perhaps Amelia. Perhaps another word lost through the door. The handle is tried. It turns easily. The room beyond contains no one. Moonlight lies across the carpet. Furniture stands in its proper place. The air feels cold enough to sting the throat. The witness steps inside, and the voice stops. On the far side of the room, a curtain shifts beside the window. There is no open pane behind it. The person moves closer. The curtain settles. For a moment, the glass reflects only the room and the witness standing in it. Then a second face appears in the reflection, close beside his shoulder. The witness turns. Nobody is there. When he looks back at the window, the face remains. George III's Windsor ghost is deeply unsettling because it does not always seem aware of the living. Henry's footsteps cross the guard's path. Elizabeth's figure turns and withdraws. George stands within a private world, still speaking to people who cannot answer him. There is sorrow in that image, though pity does not make the experience safe. A person trapped inside an old grief may react badly when disturbed. Some stories describe the king appearing calm. Others give him an agitated expression, his eyes fixed upon the witness with sudden recognition. One can imagine the moment when the ghost at the window finally notices the courtyard below. The old face lifts, the mouth stops moving, the eyes settle upon the guard. Then the hand rises and presses flat against the inside of the glass. The guard is several stories below, yet he hears the faint squeak of skin moving across the pane. Windsor has another king whose death left a more violent mark upon the national memory. Charles I did not die in the castle, though his body was brought there under conditions so bleak that the account reads like the beginning of a haunting. By January 1649, England had passed through years of civil war. Towns had been besieged, families had divided, fields, churches, and houses bore the marks of armies moving across the country. The king had lost the war, escaped, negotiated, been imprisoned and finally placed on trial by men who claimed authority to judge him. For those raised to believe that a king ruled by divine appointment, the trial itself carried a sense of sacrilege. Charles refused to recognize the court. He maintained a controlled manner, though he understood where events were leading. On the morning of January 30th, he dressed carefully. The weather was bitterly cold, and he wore an extra shirt so that shivering would not be mistaken for fear. He walked to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Soldiers kept the crowd at a distance. The executioner concealed his identity. Charles spoke, prayed, and placed his head upon the block. The axe fell. A groan moved through the crowd. The body of an anointed king lay beneath the winter sky, separated from its head. Afterwards, those responsible faced an awkward and dangerous question. Where should Charles be buried, and with what ceremony? His supporters wanted the dignity of a royal funeral. The new authorities wanted silence. The body was eventually carried to Windsor, with instructions that the burial take place privately, without pomp or noise. Snow lay on the ground when the coffin arrived in February. The mourners hoped to place Charles in the royal burial place of Henry VII at Westminster, but permission was denied. At St. George's Chapel, they discovered the vault containing Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. The coffin was lowered beside them. There were no great bells, no vast public procession, and none of the splendor that usually accompanied the burial of a king. Snow fell through the open west door of the chapel and settled upon the black velvet, covering the coffin. Charles disappeared into the vault beneath the floor. For more than a century, uncertainty surrounded the precise location of his remains. In 1813, workmen discovered a lead coffin in the vault, bearing an inscription identifying Charles. The Prince Regent authorized an examination. The coffin was opened, and those present saw the king's body, darkened by time but recognizable. The head had been placed back with the body. When lifted, the features could still be observed beneath the decay. The men took relics. Fragments of bone and hair were removed before some were later returned. The act added another layer of disturbance to a burial already stripped of dignity. At Windsor, Charles is said to appear near the chapel and in passages connected with the lower ward. The figure is often described in dark clothing. He moves slowly, with the composed bearing seen in portraits of the king. His face may be hidden by shadow, though witnesses sometimes report a dark line or unnatural softness around the neck. A guard on a night round sees a man walking ahead of him. The stranger has entered an area where visitors should not be present. His pace is calm. He wears a long, dark cloak, and his shoes make very little sound against the ground. The guard calls to him. The man does not turn. He continues towards the chapel. The guard follows, closing the distance. The figure appears solid, and the folds of the cloak move naturally with each step. Yet the air around him has a peculiar stillness. Wind touches the guard's face, but the stranger's hair and clothing remain unaffected. A second challenge is given. The man stops. For several seconds, he stands with his back to the guard. Then his head turns slightly, farther than the shoulders move. The pale side of his face becomes visible. There is a line around the throat, dark and narrow, as though a cord has been drawn tightly through the skin. The guard takes a step forward. The figure turns fully. His expression is calm, almost sorrowful. He raises one hand, perhaps asking for silence, perhaps offering a blessing. Then the chapel bell sounds once. The guard glances towards the tower. When he looks back, the man has vanished. No door has opened, no shadow crosses the ground. The space where he stood contains only falling mist. Another story is heard rather than seen. Late at night, several people inside the lower ward hear the sound of men walking together. Their tread is slow and carefully matched, as though they are carrying something heavy between them. The steps approach the chapel. There is cloth brushing against stone. A quiet command is spoken. The sound of a door follows, though the chapel entrance remains closed. The unseen group continues inside. Those listening hear the weight being lowered. Then comes a silence where bells, prayers, and music should have been. A cold current moves out from beneath the chapel door. The sound does not return. Windsor's royal hauntings often gather around interrupted endings. Henry did not receive his great tomb. Charles did not receive the public funeral expected for a king. George III lost himself before death took him. Elizabeth spent a lifetime turning her body and private feelings into a symbol that could outlast her. Each spirit seems to carry the unfinished shape of a final condition. Yet the castle's dead are not limited to monarchs. Thousands of people have lived, worked, served, prayed, and guarded at Windsor. Most passed through history without portraits, grand tombs, or biographies. Their lives remain in household records, military rolls, church registers, and occasional letters, though many have vanished almost completely. The lesser-known ghosts of Windsor emerge from that hidden population. There are stories of a young soldier seen near the Long Walk, standing beneath the trees in an older uniform. There are accounts of a woman crossing a service passage with folded linen in her arms before disappearing through a wall. Some people have reported the laughter of children in rooms where none were present. Others have heard a woman weeping behind a locked door. One of the most troubling figures is a guard who appears where no guard should be. A sentry notices another soldier standing at a distance along his route. The man is partly hidden beneath an arch, but the uniform is clear enough to suggest that he belongs there. The sentry watches for a signal or movement. The other guard remains still. Minutes pass. The sentry becomes annoyed. He calls quietly. The figure lifts one hand. The gesture is wrong. It is too slow and seems to come from a shoulder held at an unnatural angle. The hand reaches the brim of the cap, though the fingers pass slightly through it. The sentry steps closer. The uniform begins to look old. The cut of the tunic, the equipment, and the shape of the headwear belong to another period. The man's face is young, perhaps scarcely beyond boyhood. His skin has the grey cast of someone found after a cold night. There is a dark mark beneath his chin. The figure opens its mouth. No voice comes. Instead, a distant rifle shot cracks through the night. The sentry flinches. The archway is empty. Stories connect a spectral soldier with tragedy near the Long Walk, and the figure remains even as names and dates shift between tellings. Windsor housed generations of young men serving far from home and carrying private burdens beneath the discipline of uniform. A ghost never needed fame to remain tied to the place where his life ended. The Long Walk itself is among the most recognizable approaches to Windsor. It runs in a grand straight line from the castle towards the Copper Horse statue on Snow Hill, bordered for much of its length by trees. By day, the avenue is broad, open, and stately. Walkers, cyclists, and families use it, beneath views of the castle rising in the distance. After dark, the same straightness becomes unnerving. There is nowhere for a person ahead to turn without being seen. A figure can remain visible for a long time, small and dark beneath the trees, while the walker behind slowly gains upon it. One account tells of a man returning along the avenue in poor weather. Mist has settled close to the ground, blurring the base of the trees. The castle lights remain visible far ahead, steady and warm. A soldier stands beside the path. The walker assumes he is on duty, though the hour and position seem unusual. As he approaches, the soldier turns away from the castle and looks into the park. The walker offers a greeting. There is no reply. The soldier steps onto the avenue and begins walking towards him. His boots make no sound. The mist parts around the legs but does not touch them. The uniform becomes clearer, darkened by damp or age. A strap crosses the chest. The face beneath the cap is pale and exhausted. The walker moves to one side. The soldier moves to the same side. The walker changes direction. Again, the figure blocks him. They are now close enough for the walker to see that the soldier's eyes are open too widely. His lips tremble as though he is trying to speak through numbness. The walker asks whether he needs help. The soldier raises one hand and points behind him, away from Windsor. Far down the avenue, another figure has appeared. It is much taller. The walker turns back to the soldier. The young man is gone. The mist where he stood is spinning slowly, disturbed by nothing visible. Behind, the tall figure begins to move closer. Perhaps that final detail belongs to another Windsor legend beginning to enter the story. The castle's ghosts remain tied to rooms, passages, windows, and graves. The presence beyond the Long Walk belongs to the park. Before entering those woods, there are other rooms within Windsor that deserve attention. Service passages have their own stories, often quieter than the royal apparitions. One concerns a woman seen carrying folded cloth. She wears a plain dark dress and white cap, the clothing of a servant from another century. A modern worker catches sight of her ahead in a corridor. The woman walks briskly, her attention fixed upon her task. The folded linen in her arms looks heavy. She turns through an opening in the wall. The worker follows and finds only stone paneling. There is no doorway. Old plans later suggest that an entrance once existed in that position, sealed during alterations. The woman had followed a route removed from the castle long after her death. Another story begins with the sound of a child playing. A small ball rolls across the floor of an empty room and stops beside a member of staff. It is old-fashioned, made from dark material worn smooth by use. The worker looks towards the doorway, expecting a child to appear and retrieve it. A giggle comes from behind a large piece of furniture. The worker walks around it. Nobody is there. When she turns back, the ball has moved to the center of the room. A second laugh sounds directly above her. The ceiling is too high for anyone to be there. The worker leaves and returns with a colleague. The ball has vanished, no child is found, and no visitor has reported a missing toy. Later that evening, as the same worker prepares to leave, she finds the ball resting inside her coat pocket. There is a temptation to treat stories of ghostly children as gentler than the apparitions of wounded kings. The experience itself would be deeply frightening. Children do not belong alone in locked rooms after midnight. Their laughter carries warmth when a living child is near. Heard without a body, it becomes a sound stripped of safety. The weeping woman is more direct. A sob is heard behind a door in a private or restricted part of the castle. The witness assumes someone is distressed and knocks before entering. The crying stops, the room is empty. As the witness turns to leave, a woman speaks close to the floor. She says very softly that she cannot find him. The witness looks down. Beneath a table, two pale hands are gripping the edge of the carpet. They withdraw before the face attached to them can be seen. The room is searched, nothing is found. Later, the sobbing begins again from inside, a cupboard too shallow to conceal a person. Retelling has altered the details, although the woman's sobbing remains fixed behind the closed door. A building that contained courtship, childbirth, illness, jealousy, betrayal, and mourning has heard grief in rooms where the living later found nobody waiting. Some grief may have left more than an echo. Anne Boleyn is occasionally added to lists of Windsor ghosts, though her strongest traditions belong elsewhere, particularly the Tower of London, Blickling Hall, and places connected more closely with her life and death. She knew Windsor and appeared there as queen, yet firm local accounts are thin. A careful telling should resist placing every famous Tudor spirit inside the castle, simply because Henry is buried there. The same caution applies to numerous royal names attached to vague figures. Windsor's age invites accumulation. A pale woman becomes whichever queen best suits the storyteller. A man in old clothing becomes a king. A knock in a wall acquires a death behind it. The genuine mystery survives careful attention. Even after doubtful additions are removed, Windsor retains a remarkable body of supernatural tradition. Henry's dragging tread, Elizabeth's heels, George at the window, Charles near the chapel, the unknown soldiers and servants, the voices in empty rooms, and the horned phantom beyond the walls are enough to make the castle one of Britain's great haunted places. The strongest accounts share a simple quality. The witnesses do not seek the dead interrupt ordinary duties. A guard checks a passage, a worker closes a room, a person crosses a courtyard, someone looks up at a window, then the past steps into view. The interruption may be brief, but Windsor makes it impossible to forget. Henry VIII's grave lies only a short walk from the corridor. Chapel bells sound above his coffin, and portraits preserve the face that turned towards the witness in the dark. The history presses against the encounter from every side. In November 1992, another kind of terror entered the castle when fire broke out in the private chapel. The blaze began during restoration work, apparently when a curtain came into contact with a spotlight. Flames spread into the roof spaces and moved through rooms filled with historic objects. Smoke rose above Windsor. Firefighters fought for hours while staff, soldiers, and volunteers formed chains to carry furniture, paintings, and other treasures away from danger. The sight of the castle burning shocked the country. Windsor had survived for centuries, yet fire moved through it with terrifying speed. Ceilings collapsed, timber blazed above rooms associated with royal ceremony. Water poured across floors, smoke blackened stone and plaster. Parts of the building opened to the sky. Among the people saving objects were men and women who had worked in those rooms, knew their contents, and understood what might be lost. The effort had a practical urgency, though it also carried something older, the instinct to protect a place entrusted to the living by generations already gone. The fire lasted for 15 hours. More than 100 rooms were damaged, including St. George's Hall. The restoration took years. Walls were opened, floors were lifted, blackened beams came down. Spaces normally hidden were exposed beneath work lights. Craftspeople studied surviving fragments and rebuilt rooms using traditional skills alongside modern methods. Old buildings often gain new ghost stories during restoration. Disturbance provides an easy explanation. A wall is broken and a presence is released. A coffin is moved and footsteps begin. Furniture leaves a room and the former owner returns to find it. There is no need to claim that the Windsor fire awakened anything. The idea would have crossed many minds as damaged rooms opened after centuries of occupation. Imagine working alone during the restoration after the larger crews have left. The room around you has no ceiling. Temporary covering shifts in the wind. Scaffolding rises where walls once held portraits and tapestries. The air smells of wet ash, cut timber, and old smoke. From the far side of the ruined hall comes a footstep. You call, assuming another worker remains. A second step answers from above, on a section of floor destroyed by the fire. Dust falls through the open beams. Then a woman in black crosses the gap where the upper gallery used to be. She walks upon nothing. For 3 or 4 seconds, her full figure is visible, against the pale covering beyond the roof. Her dress moves as though stirred by an indoor breeze. She reaches the surviving wall and passes through it. The worker stands beneath her path, looking upwards. A small piece of blackened wood drops beside his boot. From within the wall comes the sharp sound of heels continuing along a floor that burned away. The restored castle eventually reopened, its damaged rooms repaired so completely that many visitors would struggle to identify where destruction had occurred. St. George's Hall rose again with a new hammer beam roof. Stone, plaster, timber, and paint concealed the scars. Windsor returned to its familiar appearance. A haunting, however, does not depend upon visible ruin. The most frightening room may be the one restored to perfection, where every surface appears secure and the footsteps still follow the route of a gallery that no longer exists. During the Second World War, Windsor carried another atmosphere of fear. The castle became a refuge for the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret during bombing. Windows were blacked out, valuable objects were moved or protected. The family endured air raid warnings while London and other cities suffered attacks. The castle's walls offered physical security, but war entered through sound. Sirens could be heard. Aircraft passed overhead. News arrived of deaths and destruction. Soldiers guarded a residence that enemy bombers might recognize from the air. In darkness, Windsor's towers disappeared beneath camouflage and blackout measures. The young princesses slept within a castle already filled with stories of royal ghosts. Later tales claim that Elizabeth and Margaret encountered the apparition of Elizabeth I, though the details come through repeated secondary accounts and should be held lightly. The story usually places the girls in a room when the Tudor Queen appeared before them, dressed in black. Whether or not that meeting occurred, the idea has endured. Because it joins two Elizabeths across the centuries, one a princess sheltering during war, the other a dead queen associated with the survival of England under threat. Another wartime haunting begins inside Windsor during the long blackout nights there. A young member of staff crosses a darkened room during an air raid warning. Heavy curtains cover the windows. Furniture has been shifted, and paintings removed for safety have left pale rectangles upon the walls. She hears someone whisper from the far corner. The words are old-fashioned but clear. They ask whether the Armada has been sighted. The woman stops. Another voice answers from close beside her, though no one is there. Not yet, it says. A hand touches the blackout curtain from behind. The fabric presses inward in the shape of 5 long fingers. Outside the window lies only open air high above the courtyard. The siren continues over Windsor, while the hand slowly moves down the cloth and disappears. The castle has lived through enough national danger for one century's fear to resemble another. A queen awaiting news of Spanish ships, a princess listening for German aircraft, and a modern guard watching an unidentified light can occupy the same room in different years. Under strain, time may feel less firmly divided. Many ghost traditions suggest that apparitions become more active during crisis. Royal spirits are said to appear before deaths, wars, or changes in the crown. Such claims are nearly impossible to test. Stories are often remembered after an event and forgotten when nothing follows. Still, Windsor's role at the center of monarchy gives every strange sighting the character of an omen. A figure at a window may be a ghost. A figure at a royal window before a funeral becomes a warning. One night, according to a story told in several forms, a guard sees 3 lights moving inside a room known to be empty. They do not resemble torches or lamps. Each is pale and roughly human in height, drifting past the windows one after another. The first moves slowly, the second follows, the third stops and turns towards the courtyard. The guard reports the disturbance. The room is checked and found secure. By morning, news arrives of a death connected with the household. The tale gives no names in its most responsible form. Later tellers attach whichever royal death best suits the date. The nameless version is more disturbing. 3 lights cross the room, and somewhere beyond the castle, a family receives a telephone call. Windsor's position above the town makes upper windows especially powerful in these stories. People below can see a shape long before they can reach the room. The distance prevents immediate understanding. A face may remain framed in glass while the witness crosses an entire courtyard. One guard reported seeing a woman at a window after midnight. Her clothing could not be distinguished, but her hair appeared loose around her shoulders. She struck the glass with both hands. The guard looked for signs of smoke or danger. The woman continued beating the window, her mouth open in a scream that could not be heard through the pane. Help was summoned. As people entered the corridor leading to the room, the woman stopped. She lowered her arms and looked past the guard towards someone behind her. Her face changed. She stepped backwards out of sight. The door was opened within moments. The room was empty. One chair had been overturned beside the window. The glass was cold. There were no marks upon it. The guard remained below, watching the room while it was searched. During that search, he saw the woman reappear behind the people inside. She stood among them, close enough to touch, while they looked beneath furniture and behind curtains. Then another figure rose behind her. The guard shouted into his radio. The room went dark. When the lights returned, everyone inside was standing exactly where they had been. None had seen the woman. None had felt the figure behind her. Such a story carries the shape of domestic violence or murder, though no particular event can be confidently tied to it. Windsor has contained private suffering hidden from public view. Royal residences are homes as well as symbols, and homes can preserve fear within ordinary rooms. The castle's grandeur can make that intimacy easy to forget. A bedroom remains a bedroom even when its ceiling is gilded. A corridor can still feel lonely beneath portraits. A nursery can hold the same night terrors as any other, though the figures watching from its walls may have governed kingdoms. There are traditions of ghostly children near rooms used by royal families. Small feet run overhead. A door opens a few inches and closes when approached. Toys shift. A child's voice calls for a nurse who died centuries ago. In one story, a night worker hears a child counting from inside an unused room. The voice reaches 7 and begins again. The worker checks the corridor, then unlocks the door. The room is dark. The counting continues from behind the curtains. At 7, the worker pulls them apart. A small girl stands upon the outer ledge, several floors above the ground. Her dress is white, her feet bare. She faces away from the room and looks down into the courtyard. The worker reaches for her. The girl turns her head. Her face is old, wrinkled skin hangs around eyes that remain unmistakably those of a child. She raises one finger to her lips and steps backwards from the ledge. The worker lunges towards the window. There is no body below. Behind him, the voice begins counting again from 1. The child with the old face remains among Windsor's darker stories, where age and childhood occupy the same body. Children inherit rooms built by the dead. Old faces watch young lives from the walls, and a nursery can stand within yards of a royal tomb. The haunting need not choose one age. Another presence is associated with the library and collections. Books, documents, and objects carry histories of their own. A letter may preserve the pressure of a dead hand in faded ink. A garment may retain the shape of a body long after burial. A weapon may have been held during violence. Portraits continue to present eyes, mouths, and skin after the sitter has become bone. Staff working among such objects sometimes report a strong sense of being watched. In one account, a researcher remains late over a desk. The room is quiet except for the turning of pages and the distant movement of staff elsewhere. A chair scrapes behind him. He assumes someone has entered and continues reading. The chair scrapes again, closer. He turns. An elderly man sits at the next table wearing clothes from the late 18th century. His head is bent over a book. One hand follows the lines of text. The researcher is startled but not immediately frightened. The old man seems absorbed in his work. Then the researcher notices that the pages beneath the man's hand are blank. The old man looks up. His eyes are clouded white. He asks whether the light has returned. The researcher cannot answer. The man reaches towards him, fingers searching across the table. As the hand passes through a pool of lamplight, the flesh disappears and leaves only bone. The researcher moves back. The old man smiles. He says that Amelia's waiting. Then his body collapses inward like clothing dropped from a standing person. The chair is empty, and the blank book is gone. The name draws the story again towards George III, though the figure could be anyone. Windsor's ghosts borrow from one another. A voice associated with one king may appear beside another apparition. Memories gather in rooms and attach themselves to whatever form a witness can recognize. There are also stories of smells without sources. Perfume enters a corridor before the woman in black appears. Tobacco smoke gathers in a room where smoking has long been forbidden. Damp earth rises from the chapel floor. A foul medicinal odor precedes Henry's footsteps. Cold metal and wet leather accompany the unknown soldier. Smell is difficult to dismiss once experienced. A sound may come from another room. A shadow may be poor light. An odor surrounds the witness and enters the body with every breath. One staff member follows the scent of roses through a series of rooms. It is strongest near a locked cabinet. When the cabinet is opened, the perfume disappears and is replaced by the smell of decay. Inside sits a small object wrapped in cloth. The worker does not touch it. Another person is called. Before help arrives, something knocks from within the cabinet. 3 slow taps, the worker steps back. The wrapped object shifts slightly, as though whatever lies beneath the cloth has taken a breath. When the second person enters, the cabinet contains nothing unusual. The object remains wrapped and still. No cause for the knock is found. That night, the first worker dreams of a woman standing beside the bed, with roses pressed into her mouth. The next morning, dried petals are scattered across the bedroom floor. Stories like this extend beyond recognized royal apparitions into objects carrying the pressure of former lives. Windsor is filled with things preserved beyond the people who touched them. A chair remains after every person who sat in it has died. Jewelry survives the throat and hand for which it was made. Letters outlive secrets, and beds remain after illness and death have passed through them. The castle serves as a container for human presence. Perhaps some presence refuses to separate from the object that held it. Among all these rooms, the chapel continues to exert the strongest pull. People attending services may feel comfort, beauty, and profound stillness there. Others report sudden cold, pressure around the shoulders, or the sense of a person standing behind them when the stalls are empty. A choir member once hears another voice singing from below. It begins beneath the floor during a quiet passage, too low to belong to anyone present. The note is rough and male, sustained without breath. It does not follow the melody exactly. It seems to answer it. The singer looks down. The voice rises through the stone beneath his feet. Others continue, apparently unaware. The hidden singer grows louder until the choir member can distinguish words within the note. They are not part of the service. The voice says, "Open it." The choir member loses his place. At once, the sound below stops. After the service, he asks whether anyone else heard it. One older man avoids the question. Later, he quietly advises the singer never to answer a voice that comes from beneath the choir. Why would such advice exist unless someone else had heard it? At night, the chapel can appear almost impossibly still. Moonlight gathers in patches where the windows allow it. Carved faces emerge from stalls and monuments. The ceiling remains mostly hidden, giving the darkness a height without limit. A person alone there might hear settling stone, distant bells or movement outside. Then comes a sound from the vault, a dull impact beneath the floor, a pause, another impact directly under the slab. Marking Henry VIII, the witness approaches. The third knock comes from beneath Charles I. A fourth answers from farther away, within the royal vault. The sounds continue, moving beneath the chapel as though something is passing from coffin to coffin. When they stop, the main door behind the witness opens by itself. Cold air enters. In the doorway stands a line of figures. Some wear crowns, some have no faces. One holds its head beneath an arm. Another leans heavily upon a damaged leg. At the back stands an old man with white eyes, whispering towards someone who is not there. The witness closes his eyes and begins to pray. The figures do not advance. They wait until he reaches the final words. Then a woman's heel strikes the stone directly behind him. The chapel is empty when he turns. The chapel gathers every royal tradition around the ground where the bodies remain. Windsor's dead are separated by centuries in history and only a few yards in burial, with the choir, aisles, and vaults holding monarchs, whose apparitions still cross the castle above them. Night draws those stories towards St. George's as surely as prayer draws the living there by day. There is a point in the evening when Windsor Castle seems to withdraw from the town beneath it. The streets remain active for a while. Restaurant doors open and close. Glasses touch tables. Cars move along the roads below the walls. People pause to photograph the illuminated towers before walking towards the station or the river. Above them, the castle grows quieter. The public rooms darken, private windows show occasional light. A guard crosses a courtyard and disappears beneath an arch. The flag above the round tower moves in a wind that cannot be felt at street level. From below, the castle looks secure. Inside, security means that every unexpected movement must be noticed. Consider a soldier beginning a night duty during winter. The air has the sharpness of frost. His breath appears briefly when he steps into an open court. The stone beneath his boots holds the day's cold. He knows where other guards are stationed and when relief should arrive. For the first hour, nothing happens. A clock sounds, a radio murmurs and falls quiet. Somewhere within the residence, a door closes. The guard walks his route and returns. On the second round, he notices an open door. It stands at the end of a passage and reveals complete darkness beyond. He is certain it had been shut earlier. The door belongs to a room that should remain secured. He reports it and approaches. The darkness inside has an unusual density. Light from the passage reaches the threshold and seems to end there, as though the room contains smoke or black cloth. The guard shines a torch inside. The beam touches the floor, a table and part of a wall. Nothing moves. Then the light catches a pair of shoes beneath the table. They are black, broad, and old-fashioned. The feet within them point towards the guard. He raises the beam. The space above the shoes is empty. The shoes begin to move. One slides forward, followed by the other. They do not lift naturally. They scrape over the floor as though a body too weak to walk is dragging them from beneath the table. The guard steps back. The shoes reach the edge of the light and stop. From the darkness above them comes a long, tired breath. The door slams. When help arrives, the room is opened and searched. No shoes are found. The table stands undisturbed. Dust near its legs shows only one mark, a broad line running from beneath it to the doorway. The mark resembles the path of a damaged foot. This incident might immediately be assigned to Henry VIII. As we have mentioned before many times, this is his signature, though the castle has held many people who struggle to walk. Old age, injury, illness, and war passed through Windsor long before modern medicine. The famous name may cover a less celebrated dead person whose pain happened in the same passage. The idea raises a troubling question. How many Windsor ghosts have been given royal identities because ordinary names were forgotten? A woman in black becomes Elizabeth I because people recognize the outline of a queen. A distressed old man becomes George III because his suffering is known. A limping figure becomes Henry because his wounds are part of history. The castle may contain servants, soldiers, and visitors whose appearances have been absorbed into grander legends. One account from the domestic side of the castle concerns a man seen carrying coal. A worker descends a service staircase and finds him climbing slowly from below. He wears rough clothes darkened by dust. A heavy container hangs from one hand. His face is streaked black, and sweat shines along his forehead. The worker moves aside to let him pass. The man stops upon the step below and looks up. His eyes are red around the rims as though irritated by smoke. He asks whether the fires are lit. The worker assumes he is part of a maintenance team and says that he does not know. The man listens. From somewhere above comes the faint crackle of burning timber. His expression changes to fear. He drops the container. Instead of striking the stairs, it passes through them. Coal spills soundlessly into darkness beneath the stone. The man turns and runs downwards. His body fades with each step until only the white shapes of his eyes remain below. Then the staircase fills with smoke. The worker retreats and raises an alarm, believing a fire has begun. No smoke is found elsewhere. Within minutes, the air clears. A smell of coal remains on his clothing for days. Perhaps the figure belongs to the centuries when countless fires had to be kept burning throughout the castle. Perhaps he died in an accident or witnessed a blaze now absent from the record. Perhaps the 1992 fire gave an older spirit new urgency. The haunting repeats a worker's fear that the flames have returned. Windsor's kitchens and service rooms would have been dangerous places in earlier centuries. Open fires, boiling liquids, knives, heavy equipment, and exhausted labor created opportunities for injury. Servants worked before dawn and after the household slept. Their world ran beneath the splendor seen by guests. A royal banquet appeared in a hall only because unseen people carried heat, weight, and risk through narrow passages. Ghost stories follow those routes. There is a tale of bells ringing in a servant's corridor after the old system had been disconnected. In large houses, bells once summoned staff from rooms far away. Each bell corresponded to a chamber and moved when someone pulled a cord. At Windsor, according to the story, one bell began to shake late at night. Its label identified a room no longer used for sleeping. A member of staff watched it ring several times, stop, and begin again with greater force. No modern mechanism connected it to the room. Another worker was called. Together they went upstairs. The chamber was empty, though the bed cover had been pulled back and a deep impression marked the pillow. The bell cord hung beside the bed. As they entered, it lifted from the wall and drew itself down. Far below, the bell rang. One worker approached the cord and let it go. A whisper came from beneath the bed. The voice said that the king was dying. They looked at one another. The bed began to shake. Not violently at first. The mattress trembled as though someone beneath the covers was struggling to breathe. The depression in the pillow deepened. The sheet pulled tight around the shape of a large unseen body. A groan filled the room. The workers backed away. The bell cord drew down once more. Then the invisible weight left the bed. The mattress rose. The pillow slowly returned to shape. Downstairs, the bell continued ringing until dawn. Stories of deathbed hauntings are common in royal buildings because monarchs often died surrounded by ceremony. Physicians, clergy, servants, and anxious relatives. The final breath of a king could change the government of a country. A room of illness became a room of succession the instant life ended. At Windsor, several monarchs died within the castle, including George III, George IV, and William IV. Their last illnesses unfolded in chambers where messages moved quickly and voices remained low. Imagine the castle on the night of a royal death in the early 19th century. Rain touches the windows, candles burn in rooms where nobody dares sleep. Physicians enter and leave with guarded faces. Servants carry water, linen, and messages. Family members wait in nearby apartments. Inside the bedchamber, the king's breath becomes weaker. A clock is heard too clearly. When the final moment arrives, everyone present watches for certainty. A hand is placed near the mouth. A pulse is sought. Someone closes the eyes. Beyond the room, a bell begins. News travels through the castle and towards London. The old reign ends before the body has cooled. Years later, a member of staff walks past the chamber at the same hour and hears people moving inside. There is a physician's quiet command, the clink of a glass, and a woman suppressing a sob. The door is closed. The staff member knows the room is unused and continues walking. A man's voice calls from within. It asks who has the crown. The staff member stops. The question comes again, louder. Who has the crown? The handle turns. The door opens a few inches. A strip of candlelight appears, though the room should be dark. Within that narrow gap, several people stand around a bed. Their clothing belongs to another century. Every face is turned towards the person in the corridor. The body upon the bed sits upright. Its eyes remain closed. Its mouth opens. The question comes a third time. The staff member runs. Behind him, the door opens fully, and many feet enter the passage. He does not look back until reaching another occupied area. No one follows. When the room is checked, darkness and dust remain. The dead king's question lingers because succession never answered the fear beneath it. The crown passed onwards, as it always had, but the man who wore it could not go with it. Windsor contains countless reminders that monarchy outlives monarchs. Portraits remain upon walls while the people within them are buried below. Names repeat across generations. George follows George, Edward follows Edward, Elizabeth follows Elizabeth, and the castle receives each new family while retaining the rooms of the old. A sovereign may feel permanent in public life, yet Windsor has seen so many carried away that permanence belongs only to the institution and the stones. The ghosts seem unwilling to accept that distinction. Elizabeth still walks like a queen. Henry's approach still demands space. Charles still raises a hand for silence. George still looks from the window of a castle that continued without him. Their authority survives only as habit. A guard is not required to salute a dead king. though some have reportedly done so before understanding what they saw. One story places a soldier near an entrance during a cold, clear night. A man approaches wearing a military cloak over clothes from the 17th century. His hair falls to the shoulders. He has a narrow face and carefully shaped beard. The guard recognizes him from portraits of Charles I, and it's here where I should say this eyewitness account is similar to an earlier one involving King Charles, just with a more grim ending. Recognition arrives slowly. At first, the figure simply looks like an actor or visitor wearing costume. Then the guard notices that his steps make no sound and his breath does not appear in the cold. The man stops. The guard, acting from instinct and discipline, comes to attention. Charles inclines his head. For a moment, neither moves. Then the king speaks. He asks whether they have come for him again. The guard does not know how to answer. Charles looks towards the chapel. A dark stain appears around his collar and spreads down the front of his clothes. His head tilts slightly to one side, held by very little. The guard raises a hand to summon assistance. Charles steps closer. His head slips from his shoulders. He catches it calmly in both hands. The eyes remain open. The mouth tells the guard not to let them take him below. Then the body turns and walks towards the chapel, carrying the head against its chest. The apparition fades before reaching the door. The guard remains at attention until another soldier arrives. Charles usually returns with mournful calm, although the severed head appears in Windsor's most dreadful tellings. His coffin was opened in 1813, his remains examined and pieces taken away, allowing the violence of execution to reach him again more than a century after burial. The fear of disturbance entered the haunting and never left it. St. George's Chapel has suffered disturbance through war, rebuilding, burial, and investigation. Henry VI's remains were moved there from Chertsey Abbey under Richard III. Charles was placed in Henry VIII's vault without the ceremony his supporters desired. Later monarchs and relatives entered other vaults and memorial chapels. Stones were lifted, coffins descended, names were carved above the dead. Each burial altered the spiritual population of the place. Funerals at Windsor bring daylight, music, uniforms, flowers, and public mourning. The processions move with careful dignity. Cameras remain beyond certain points. At the committal, the coffin is lowered, and the visible ceremony gives way to an enclosed resting place. After everyone leaves, the chapel holds the physical fact of the burial. The flowers begin to fade. The stone cools. The new coffin joins those already there. A guard outside may hear a sound from within after the doors are secured. A single knock, then another. A third comes from below the floor. Old fears of burial alive gather quickly when a knock rises from beneath chapel stone. The first sound can be endured, but the second carries the shape of a hand striking wood from inside the dark. A person alone beside the chapel understands that somebody below has answered. He will imagine a hand inside a coffin. The knock comes again. This time another coffin answers. The sounds begin at different points beneath the chapel, slow and irregular. One from the choir, two from the royal vault, three from the memorial chapel. They continue until the guard steps away. Then every knock stops together. As he turns to leave, something taps from inside the chapel door at the height of a human face. The guard looks through the glass. 11 figures stand in darkness beyond it. The front figure wears no crown. It is a woman in plain black, older than the portraits, but immediately recognizable. Behind her are men and women in the dress of several centuries. None move. The guard blinks. The chapel is empty. Morning services proceed as usual. The living have always answered fear at Windsor with routine. That response feels profoundly British. The bell is rung, the gate is opened. The uniform is inspected, the room is prepared. Whatever crossed the corridor at 2 a.m. is not allowed to prevent the day's duty. Pride in a place does not require pretending that nothing terrible happened there. Windsor's dignity comes partly from endurance. The castle has absorbed violent rains, private grief, and national uncertainty without becoming a monument only to suffering. It remains beautiful. On a bright morning, the view from the walls stretches across roofs, river, and countryside. The chapel glows pale against the lower ward. Soldiers move beneath the round tower. The long walk runs south in a line so straight that it seems to cut the landscape into order. That avenue leads towards a world the castle never fully controlled. The name Herne belongs so completely to Windsor that the legend loses something when carried elsewhere. Other parts of Britain have black dogs, phantom coaches, headless riders, and processions of the dead, but the horned keeper remains tied to these particular trees and to the royal grounds surrounding the castle. He belongs to the moment when the ordered avenue ends, the lamps disappear, and a person realizes that the forest has been watching the crown for longer than the crown has watched the forest. Shakespeare gave the earliest surviving written form of the tale. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Herne is already described as the ghost of an old keeper who walks around an oak during winter midnight, bearing great ragged horns, blasting trees, bewitching cattle, and shaking a chain in a hideous manner. The passage offers no patient introduction because the people of Windsor are expected to know the fear. A horned figure beneath the oak needs only a name before the imagination completes him. Later generations tried to give Herne the sort of history that a royal archive might hold. One account made him a favoured huntsman who saved a king from a charging stag and received a mortal wound in the act. A mysterious stranger restored him by fastening the stegus antlers to his head, although the cure demanded a price. Herne lost his skill, fell from royal favour, and endured the mockery of men who had once envied him. He finally hanged himself from an oak, after which his rivals discovered that their own ability to hunt had vanished. When they begged for its return, Herne led them into the forest and claimed them as the first riders in his dead company. Another telling shifts the rein, changes the king, and gives the stranger a different purpose. Herne becomes a poacher, a keeper falsely accused, a man punished for loyalty, or a servant broken by disgrace. The details move because the legend grew through mouths rather than records. The elements that remain are stronger than biography. An oak, a pair of antlers, a chain, cattle in terror, and a dead huntsman walking when winter reaches its darkest hour. The changing identity of Herne's oak has never weakened that image. One celebrated tree was felled in the 18th century. Another was accepted during Queen Victoria's reign before a storm brought it down, and later oaks inherited the title. Visitors searched for the correct trunk as though finding it could settle the legend, yet Windsor Great Park contains enough ancient trees to make certainty impossible after sunset. The wrong oak may offer safety, while the true one may stand unmarked a few hundred yards away. An old oak changes character with the light. During the afternoon, its hollows, scars, and vast limbs invite admiration. By midnight, the same trunk resembles a body rooted in pain, with broken branches raised like arms and dark openings where a face might wait. Wind moves through the crown even when the lower air feels still, and the bark can produce sounds remarkably close to breath passing through a damaged throat. A 19th century story tells of several young men who went into the park to wait beneath the tree, then believed to be Herne's oak. They carried lanterns, food, and enough drink to make the journey seem amusing. Frost had hardened the ground, and every bootstep sounded clear while the castle lights receded behind them. They reached the oak before midnight and found nothing beyond its enormous trunk. One man struck the bark with his walking stick, another called Herne by name, and the others laughed when no answer came. Their confidence lasted until a chain moved somewhere above them. The metal dragged slowly across a high branch, although their lanterns revealed nothing hanging there. The sound travelled around the crown without changing distance, passing from one side of the tree to the other. One of the men decided that somebody had climbed into the oak to frighten them and walked behind the trunk to expose the trick. His lantern remained visible for several seconds. Then the light rose quickly into the branches. The others called his name and heard him answer from high overhead. His voice sounded constricted, and he begged them not to look upwards. Bark cracked beneath a great weight, boots kicked against wood, and the chain tightened with a violent metallic snap. They raised their lanterns despite the warning. Their companion hung upside down from a branch, his ankles bound together by a dark chain that disappeared into the crown. He reached towards them with both hands, while a larger shape crouched above him. Antlers spread wider than a man's shoulders, and two pale eyes looked down through the crossing limbs. The lanterns failed together. The men fled through darkness, leaving their companion in the tree, while his cries followed them between the trunks. Keepers returned with them before dawn and found the oak empty. The missing man appeared hours later near the edge of the park, walking without shoes or coat and unable to remember how he came there. Two black bands encircled his ankles. They resembled burns left by metal, though the skin never blistered and the marks remained cold to the touch. He remembered reaching the far side of the oak and seeing a huntsman pressing one hand against the bark. The stranger asked whether he had come to join the king's sport. When the young man laughed, the chain closed around his legs and the ground dropped away beneath him. He refused to enter Windsor Great Park after sunset for the rest of his life. The chain offers the most reliable warning in Herne's tradition. A walker hears it far among the trees and mistakes it for a gate moving in the wind. The second rattle comes from another direction. The third sounds close enough to suggest that somebody has crossed the intervening ground without making a footstep. A park keeper once heard that progression while checking a wooded enclosure at dusk. Rain had softened the earth, and the last light lay grey between the trunks. He knew the sounds of deer, branches, and work carried out elsewhere in the park. But the chain moved with the deliberate pull of something walking. A stag stepped into the clearing. Ahead. It stood larger than the animals ordinarily seen there, with a dark coat and antlers carrying strips of dead vegetation. A length of iron hung around its neck and trailed back into the trees. The keeper moved closer, believing the animal had caught itself in discarded fencing or equipment. The stag watched him approach without fear. A human hand closed around the other end of the chain. The fingers appeared first against the bark, followed by an arm covered in a dark hunting coat. A tall figure leaned from behind the tree without revealing his lower body. Antlers rose from his head in a spread almost identical to those of the stag, making the animal and huntsman seem connected across the clearing. The keeper stopped. The horned man pulled once upon the chain. The stag opened its mouth and a human scream came from within it. Every deer in the surrounding woodland began running. Hooves struck soft ground on all sides, bodies crashed through undergrowth, and branches broke at the height of antlers, yet no animals entered the clearing. The keeper heard the herd circling him, while Herne remained partly concealed behind the trunk. The chain tightened again. The stag collapsed inward as though its bones and organs had been withdrawn through the neck. Hide folded upon the ground beneath the antlers, and the metal slid back towards the tree wet with blood. The keeper ran. A hunting horn sounded behind him, followed by hounds calling from several directions. He reached open grass without seeing the animals chasing him, although panting moved close around his legs and mud lifted beneath invisible paws. Windsor Castle appeared far ahead, illuminated above the long walk. He continued until other people came into view. When the clearing was examined later, no hide, blood, or chain remained. A single hoof print marked the earth, much larger than any deer track the keepers recognized. A broken iron link lay within it. The man carried the fragment home. It remained cold beside the fire and developed fresh rust before deaths in the royal household. On the final night of his own life, his family heard a chain circling the house while hounds cried from the lane. Herne gradually became associated with the Wild Hunt, a supernatural procession found in different forms across northern Europe. Riders, warriors, hounds, and the restless dead crossed the land or sky beneath a spectral leader, and their passing warns of war, disaster, or approaching death. Windsor placed the horned keeper at the front of that terrible company, giving the forest a procession capable of rivaling every ceremony within the castle. Before periods of national danger, witnesses have claimed to hear the hunt moving through the park. Hooves cross ground without leaving marks, hounds cry where no kennel stands, and a horn rolls through the woodland with enough force to disturb deer across a wide area. Herne offers no explanation. He rides, and the living discover the meaning later. A story set shortly before the First World War concerns a household servant walking close to the park at twilight. She heard horses approaching along the road and stepped aside, expecting a royal party or a group returning from exercise. The first animal emerged without producing any sound from its hooves. Its coat appeared black beneath white foam, and its eyes reflected a dull red light. The rider wore an old hunting coat with the collar raised, while antlers climbed above a face hidden in shadow. A chain crossed his body and extended backwards towards the riders following him. They came in pairs, some wore medieval clothing, others Tudor dress or the torn uniforms of soldiers from later centuries. Several carried wounds across the face and throat. One rider held his own head beneath an arm, while the empty neck continued to turn towards the road. Hounds ran among the horses, lean enough for ribs to show through hides that became transparent whenever they passed through moonlight. The servant pressed herself against a tree. Near the rear of the procession, a young soldier rode with the chain wrapped around his chest. His uniform belonged to the present day, and his face resembled the servant's brother, who was alive and serving abroad. He looked directly at her as the horse passed. She called his name. The soldier reached towards her, but the chain tightened and dragged him sideways in the saddle. Herne raised the horn at the front of the hunt. The note rolled back along the road, every rider accelerated, and the young man disappeared into darkness before his sister could touch his hand. Her brother later died during the war. The family believed that she had seen the hunt gathering those who would soon belong to it. Whether the account took its final shape before or after the telegram arrived cannot now be known, although the grief behind it belonged to countless British homes. Familiar young men entered uniform and returned as names carved into memorials, leaving parents, siblings, and sweethearts to imagine where the dead might travel together. Herne's company can contain every age because Windsor offers an endless supply of memory. Hunters thrown from horses, soldiers killed abroad, prisoners who died behind walls, and servants buried without public notice can all ride beneath the same horn. The wild hunt pays little attention to rank. A king and stable boy may be joined by one chain once the forest has claimed them. That threat separates Herne from the royal apparitions. Henry, Elizabeth, George, and Charles remain tied to their faces, rooms, and graves. Herne strips identity away and turns the dead into movement. A person who meets him may return marked, vanish into the park, or appear years later among riders, glimpsed for only a moment. The hunter does not need Windsor Castle to remember him. The trees remain enough. One of the darkest accounts attached to Windsor Great Park begins with an ordinary decision to take the shorter route home. The witness was a young man who had spent the evening with friends near Windsor and knew the ground well enough to believe that moonlight, a clear path, and the distant castle would keep him oriented. Winter had stripped the trees, the weather was dry, and the long walk offered a straight line towards the town. He entered the park shortly before midnight. The first part of the journey felt peaceful. Frost whitened the grass, the castle stood bright at the end of the avenue, and the air carried the clean stillness of a cold English night. Deer grazed beyond the trees in scattered groups, occasionally raising their heads as he passed. His footsteps fell evenly upon the hard ground, and the light from Windsor gave him a fixed point towards which he could walk. After several minutes, the deer stopped feeding together. Every animal turned towards the woodland on his left. The movement passed through the herd without noise, dozens of heads lifting at almost the same moment. The man slowed, expecting a dog, keeper, or larger stag to emerge. Nothing appeared between the trunks. A branch broke deep inside the trees. The deer moved away from the sound in complete silence. They did not scatter wildly or call. They crossed the open ground with quick, controlled steps and gathered farther from the wood, leaving the man alone beside the avenue. He continued towards the castle. A metallic rattle sounded behind him. The noise resembled a loose chain drawn once across stone, brief enough to be mistaken for something ordinary. He looked back and saw only the long walk extending into darkness. Frost reflected weakly along the surface, and the line of trees remained unbroken on either side. The chain moved again from the woods to his right. This second drag lasted longer. Iron passed over roots or rough bark, stopped, and gave a final small movement as though the person carrying it had adjusted their grip. The man quickened his pace without running. Windsor Castle remained ahead, although the distance between them seemed unchanged. He checked his watch and discovered that only a few minutes had passed. The avenue began narrowing around him. The trees had not moved, yet their upper branches appeared to meet more closely overhead. Moonlight withdrew from the path, and the illuminated castle became partly hidden behind a mist rising from the ground. The man could still see the round tower, but its position shifted whenever he looked away, appearing first ahead and then strangely to one side. A dog barked in the distance, another answered farther along the park. Soon several hounds were calling to one another, their voices moving through the trees in a wide circle around the avenue. The man knew that hunting had ended long ago and that no pack should be running there at midnight. He continued walking while the cries grew more numerous. The first hound crossed the path ahead. He saw only its outline, low. and fast, with a long body and head carried close to the ground. Moonlight passed through its ribs. The animal entered the opposite trees without disturbing the frost. A second followed, then a third. They crossed at different distances, all traveling from left to right. Some appeared black, while others held the grey transparency of smoke. One stopped in the middle of the path and looked towards the man. Its face was human. The features belonged to an elderly male, stretched across the narrow skull of the hound. The mouth opened too widely and released a hunting cry in the voice of a man. The animal turned and vanished into the trees with the others. The witness began running. The castle lights dimmed behind the mist, and the long walk no longer seemed straight. The path curved through woodland he did not remember entering. Roots rose from the ground, forcing him to watch his feet, while branches reached across at face height. He heard hounds behind him, though their paws made no sound upon the frost. A horn called from ahead. The note was low, powerful, and close enough to vibrate in his chest. It did not resemble music played for ceremony or sport. The sound held the rough breath of an animal and continued too long for human lungs. The man stopped because the hounds had stopped. Silence entered the wood with such completeness that he could hear his heartbeat. Mist moved between the trees, carrying the smell of wet leaves, horse sweat, and cold iron. A large shadow stood beyond the nearest trunks. At first he believed it was a stag. Antlers rose against the pale sky, and a narrow head faced towards him. Then the shape moved forward upon two legs, revealing shoulders beneath a long hunting coat. A chain hung from one hand and trailed behind into the mist. Herne stepped onto the path. The figure appeared taller than any ordinary man, partly because the antlers climbed above him in an immense spread. Their points carried strips of bark, dead leaves, and something resembling dark hair. His coat belonged to no single period, containing the heavy cut of old hunting clothing and the damage of years spent among branches. Mud covered the boots, although his steps left no mark upon the frost. The face remained difficult to hold in sight. Whenever the witness tried to focus upon it, the features shifted between man, stag, and shadow. One moment showed a bearded huntsman with a wound around the throat, while the next revealed the long black muzzle of a deer. The eyes stayed constant, pale and reflective beneath the antlers. Herne asked why the man was walking upon the King's Road after midnight. The voice came from the trees around him rather than the figure's mouth. The witness answered that he was going home and meant no harm. Herne tilted his head, and the antlers scraped branches high above despite standing well below them. The hunter asked which king he served. The man gave the name of the reigning sovereign. Herne remained still for several seconds. Then he asked whether that king remembered the forest. The witness had no answer. The chain moved behind Herne. Shapes gathered within the mist, first horses and then riders. Some sat upright, others leaned in saddles, as though held there by force. Their clothing crossed centuries, and wounds marked nearly every exposed face. A medieval archer carried an arrow through the chest. A Tudor gentleman had blood across his collar, and a young soldier in 20th century uniform stared ahead with mud covering both eyes. The chain connected them all. It passed through wrists, throats, bridles, and breastplates before disappearing into the darkness. Hounds moved beneath the horses, their human faces turning towards the witness with expressions of hunger and sorrow. Herne asked whether he wished to see Windsor as the dead saw it. The man could not answer. He had been born under one sovereign, had watched another appear upon stamps and coins, and had never considered that a forest might remember older loyalties. Herne waited while the mist thickened around the riders. Their horses breathed without warmth. Leather creaked beneath bodies that had forgotten comfort, and the chain passing through them gave a small movement whenever one shifted in the saddle. The witness looked towards Windsor, hoping to find the round tower beyond the branches. The castle had disappeared. No light remained ahead or behind him. Herne repeated the question, and the hounds lowered their heads as though the answer would decide whether they fed. The witness said that he served nobody walking in the wood. The words left his mouth with less courage than he intended, yet they changed the stillness around him. Several riders turned their faces. A woman in a torn travelling cloak had one side of her skull pressed inward. A cavalryman stared through an empty socket, while rainwater ran from the brim of a hat belonging to a century when the ground beneath them had carried another name. Near the rear sat a child holding a wooden whistle. The child raised it to colourless lips, and the nearest hounds began trembling before any sound emerged. Herne watched the living man with an expression that could have been amusement. The chain lifted from the ground. It did not rise in one place, because the whole length moved together through the mist, passing across roots, bridles, wrists, and throats. Iron links came towards the witness with the smooth certainty of a snake crossing water. He stepped back and struck a tree. Bark pressed into his shoulders, cold enough to sting through his coat. The chain touched his left boot and closed around the ankle. There was no impact and no weight, only a coldness that entered the bone. He kicked, but the links passed partly through the leather before tightening somewhere inside his leg. Herne turned his horse towards the deeper wood, and the entire company began to move. The witness fell upon the frozen ground. Frost broke beneath his hands while the chain pulled him forward. The horses did not accelerate, yet the trees passed with increasing speed. Roots struck his knees, dead leaves filled his mouth, and branches caught at his clothing without touching the riders around him. The hounds ran close enough for their sides to brush his face. Their bodies carried the smell of wet fur and open graves. One animal turned its head while running. A human mouth occupied the narrow muzzle, lips split by old wounds, and a man's voice told him to keep his eyes upon the castle. The witness tried to say that the castle had vanished, though the chain dragged the words from his chest. A light appeared between the trunks. It seemed at first to belong to a lantern carried low through the wood. Then more lights joined it, arranged in rows high above the ground. Windsor Castle stood ahead of the hunt, much closer than any distance through the park should have allowed. The walls were dark and rough, without the familiar windows and restored stone of the modern residence. Timber buildings crowded the summit. Fires burned behind palisades, and men in conical helmets watched from platforms above the ditch. The hunt passed towards this first Windsor without slowing. Hounds ran through the earthworks, riders entered the timber walls, and the chain drew the witness across ground where armed men shouted without seeing them. The fortress changed around him. Wood gave way to stone while the procession continued through courtyards, filling and emptying across centuries. Towers rose, chambers widened, roofs burned and returned. The witness saw masons upon scaffolds, servants carrying rushes, horses stamping beneath royal banners, and prisoners pushed through gates with bound hands. Every age lasted only a few breaths. A medieval feast shone through an open hall before darkness swallowed it. Bells rang for a dead king. Musicians played beneath windows where a woman was crying. A plague cart crossed the lower ground, and the riders passed through it as though the bodies beneath the cloth already belonged among them. The chain pulled the witness nearer to the walls. He saw Henry VIII ride from the castle in youth, broad-shouldered and upright upon a powerful horse, surrounded by men whose laughter reached across the park. The king's face held none of the pain later carried through Windsor's passages. Hounds flowed around the hooves, horns sounded, and the royal party disappeared towards the trees. Another moment followed without warning. The same man returned inside a closed litter, swollen, feverish, and unable to bear the movement of the road. Courtiers walked beside him with guarded faces. The wild hunt crossed between the two visions, binding the vigorous hunter and the suffering king within one journey towards the grave. The witness covered his face as the chain dragged him through the chapel wall. Stone passed over his skin like deep water. He entered St. George's during a night lit by candles. A coffin rested beneath a black pool, snow melting upon the cloth. Men stood around it in silence, their boots wet from the walk across the ward. The service expected by the dead king had been denied, and the absence lay over the chapel more heavily than music. The witness recognized Charles I from the narrow face visible upon a painted panel nearby. A soft impact sounded from inside the coffin. Nobody around it reacted. The knock came again, and Herne's riders moved through the chapel stalls. The child with the wooden whistle looked towards the coffin. The third knock sounded beneath the pall. At that moment the dead company turned their heads together, although Herne continued facing forward. The witness felt the chains slacken around his ankle. He pulled hard, leaving one shoe behind, and rolled beneath the nearest horse. Its belly contained a darkness filled with moving branches. He crawled through the legs of the hunt, while iron links whipped across the chapel floor. A rider reached down with a hand missing several fingers. The child blew the wooden whistle. No human ear could have heard its note, yet every candle went out, and the hounds began screaming. The witness ran towards the chapel door. It stood open upon the long walk rather than the lower ward. Frost covered the avenue beyond it, and Windsor Castle had returned to its modern shape behind him. He crossed the threshold. The door slammed with enough force to shake snow from the trees, leaving the hunt inside the darkened chapel. For several seconds, the man heard horses moving among the stalls and chains striking the stone above royal graves. Then a hunting horn called from the far end of the avenue. Herne was no longer behind the chapel door. The horned rider stood beneath the trees ahead, waiting with the chain looped around one hand. The man turned towards the castle and ran. His missing shoe left one foot exposed to the frost, but cold had become distant beneath the terror. The round tower remained fixed above the avenue, giving him a direction even when the ground seemed to lengthen. Hounds called from both sides. Their voices crossed ahead of him, then returned from behind, forming a moving wall of sound. He did not look towards the trees. Shapes kept pace just beyond the verge, breaking no branches and leaving no prints. The chain struck the path at regular intervals, each impact nearer than the last. Herne had mounted again, and the horse approached without the rhythm of galloping hooves. A figure appeared in the center of the long walk. The witness expected the horned rider and nearly left the avenue before recognizing a soldier's outline. The young man wore a bearskin and a darkened tunic whose cut belonged to an earlier generation of guards. One side of his face carried a wound from the temple towards the jaw, though his posture remained exact. He raised a hand, directing the witness towards the edge of the path. The living man obeyed. The soldier faced south, brought an old rifle to his shoulder, and waited while the hounds grew louder. His uniform showed no movement in. Herne emerged through the mist upon a black horse. The antlers rose above the rider like dead branches torn from the crown of an oak. Behind him came the first ranks of the hunt, riders packed across the entire width of the avenue. The chain linked them in a line extending beyond sight. The dead soldier challenged the approaching company. His voice carried the formal strength of a command repeated through years of duty. Herne neither slowed nor answered. The young guard fired. A flash opened beneath the trees, revealing hundreds of pale faces behind the hunter. The report rolled towards Windsor. Every window in the castle seemed to answer with a brief white light. The witness ran while the soldier fired again. A hound cried out with a human voice. Iron struck the ground, and the sound of a body being dragged followed the living man towards the castle. He wanted to turn, yet the guard had pointed him onwards. The gate at the end of the long walk appeared closed. He reached it and found no keeper, no opening, and no time to climb. Behind him, the hunting horn sounded close enough to force the breath from his lungs. He put both hands against the iron. The bars were warm, though frost covered them. A woman's voice spoke from the darkness beyond, telling him to remain still. A figure in black stood on the castle side of the gate. Pearls gleamed within her hair, and the pale face had the long severity preserved in portraits of Elizabeth I. She looked past the witness towards the avenue. Her expression changed very little, yet one hand tightened against her dress. The gate opened without either of them touching the lock. The man stumbled through. Elizabeth raised her arm between him and the park. The hunt reached the end of the long walk. Horses, hounds, and riders stopped together beyond the bars. Herne sat at their center, antlers almost level with the upper ironwork, while the chain continued moving through the company. The queen and the hunter regarded one another across the gate. Neither spoke. Elizabeth's black dress moved in a wind absent from the avenue, and the pearls at her throat caught light from windows hidden behind the wall. Herne raised the horn. The queen lifted one finger. The chapel bell began ringing before the horn reached his mouth. Its first note passed over the castle, through the gate, and along the long walk. The nearest hounds lowered themselves to the ground. A second note followed, and the riders farther back faded into mist. By the third, Herne remained alone upon the horse. He turned towards the trees and withdrew without looking away from the gate. Elizabeth lowered her hand. The witness tried to thank her, but the queen had already become less solid than the darkness around her. Her face remained visible for a moment after the dress disappeared. The eyes turned towards Windsor Castle, where another light had appeared high above the ward. A man stood at an upper window with one hand pressed against the glass. The witness could not identify him from that distance. Elizabeth looked upwards with an expression almost tender, then passed through the gate and vanished upon the long walk. The iron closed. Frost covered the bars again, sealing away every trace of warmth. The man remained beside the wall until guards found him shortly before dawn. He wore one shoe, his clothes were torn, and a dark ring encircled his ankle beneath the trouser leg. He struggled to explain where he'd been. The route he described could not have brought him to the gate from the part of the park where he entered, and several hours had passed beyond his memory. A search along the long walk found his missing shoe placed neatly beneath an oak. Beside it lay an old cartridge case, green with age, and a line of hoofprints that ended upon hard ground without turning aside. For weeks, the mark around his ankle remained colder than the surrounding skin. It darkened at midnight and faded after the first chapel bell of morning. He woke on several nights to hear a chain moving beneath his window, though he lived far enough from the park that the sound could not have travelled from Windsor. Once he saw a young soldier standing across the road in rain, carrying the same wound along his face. The guards saluted, then turned as a black horse passed behind the houses, without making a sound. The witness never walked through Windsor Great Park after sunset again. Other people near the park have encountered only pieces of the same terror. A chain sounds beyond a hedge while the road remains empty. A black horse crosses in front of a car and disappears inside a wall of trees, too dense to receive it. Hounds begin calling across fields after every living dog has fallen silent. These fragments may last only seconds, yet the brevity gives them a particular force. A person has no time to prepare an explanation or adjust the eyes. The impossible enters ordinary life fully formed, keeps pace for a few moments, and leaves before fear can become action. One couple driving beside the park during heavy fog saw a mounted figure traveling along the verge. The horse moved level with the car, although its legs remained almost still beneath it. The rider wore a long coat. Antlers passed through low branches without shaking a single leaf. A chain hung from one hand and struck the side of the vehicle with each bend in the road. The driver accelerated. The horse remained beside them. When the passenger looked directly beneath the antlers, she found no face, only an opening filled with wet leaves turning slowly in darkness. A voice from within asked whether they had room for another traveller. The car reached a stretch of road beneath electric lamps. The mounted figure disappeared at the first pool of light, leaving the verge empty. 3 parallel scratches marked the passenger door, deep enough to reach the metal beneath the paint. The couple found a piece of oak bark upon the back seat, although every window had remained closed. A faint smell of horse sweat and damp earth lingered inside the car. Until morning. For months afterwards, the scratches filled with moisture whenever fog gathered around Windsor, even when the rest of the vehicle stayed dry. A woman walking her dog before sunrise encountered another boundary disturbance. The animal stopped near a gate and refused to continue. Its fur rose along the back, and a low cry came from its throat. The woman followed its stare towards a line of trees. A tall man stood among the trunks. The branching shape above his head could have belonged to bare limbs crossing behind him, though the rest of the wood remained still. The dog pulled towards home. She allowed it to lead her across the field, looking back only after reaching the road. The man had crossed the entire distance without being seen moving. He stood on the far side of the gate with one hand resting upon the upper bar. Antlers rose clearly against the paling sky, and a chain hung over the other wrist. The dog began trembling so violently that its collar rang. The gate opened towards the road without a sound. Herne placed one boot beyond the boundary and looked towards the first houses, where kitchen lights had begun to appear. A bell rang from St. George's Chapel. The hunter turned his head towards Windsor. Scraps of cloth hung from the antlers, including faded red, military khaki, and a strip of blue edged in gold. At the second bell, he withdrew. Mist gathered around his legs, the chain sank through the grass, the antlers faded among the trees, and the gate swung closed before the third note ended. A dead rook lay upon the road where he had stood. Around its neck was a narrow ring of black iron, without any join or fastening. The woman left it untouched. When she returned with another person after daylight, the bird and ring had gone, while the ground inside the gate carried a single hoof print, larger than that of any horse she knew. The fear surrounding Herne did not remain fixed within one telling. Shakespeare preserved the keeper at the oak, though the stage placed him inside a comic deception in which frightened people borrowed the legend because they expected Windsor to understand it. That expectation is revealing. A ghost with antlers, chain, and midnight tree already carried enough local authority to make the disguise believable. The audience could laugh at the trick while recognizing that the real keeper belonged somewhere beyond the lanterns, in a part of the forest where nobody would volunteer to wait alone. Later writers drew Herne out of those few lines and gave him a larger dominion. 19th century fascination with ruined abbeys, old houses, royal crimes, and ancestral curses found rich ground at Windsor. The castle held graves, imprisoned kings, and rooms connected with nearly every turn of English monarchy. The park offered the missing darkness. Novelists could send riders beneath its oaks, allow Tudor intrigue to cross into the supernatural, and turn Herne into the keeper of secrets hidden from the palace. Printed stories carried him far beyond Berkshire, while visitors arriving at Windsor brought the legend back with them, strengthened by everything they had read. The search for Herne's own tree became part of the haunting. Different oaks received the name, and each gathered people who believed the hunter had circled its trunk. One tree fell, another inherited the burden, and argument continued beneath branches already scarred by weather and age. The shifting location never left the park safer. It scattered the danger. A traveler could no longer reassure himself that the haunted oak stood somewhere else. Any immense trunk with a hollow deep enough to hide a man might be the place where iron moved after midnight. Old trees can hold a landscape in ways stone cannot. Their roots pass through forgotten boundaries. Their crowns rise above paths altered many times below. Deer rub against the bark, storms remove limbs, lovers cut initials, and keepers recognize individual shapes across decades. At night, those familiar marks become wounds and faces. A hollow turns into an open mouth. A branch broken by lightning resembles the shoulder of a hanging man. Wind enters the crown and produces a low complaint that travels down the trunk until a person standing beside it feels the sound through both hands. Herne's chain gives that living wood a harsher voice. Iron against bark suggests punishment, captivity, and a body fixed where it cannot escape. Some Windsor traditions speak of the chain circling the oak before the hunter appears. Others place it around his body, hanging from one wrist or stretching behind his horse towards riders hidden among the trees. The sound usually comes first. It allows the mind to understand that something is moving while the eyes remain unable to find it. Each rattle changes position. By the time antlers enter view, the witness has already been surrounded. The royal forest beneath the legend once belonged to a world of privilege, enforced with real severity. Deer were protected because kings wished to hunt them. Keepers watched the boundaries, pursued poachers, and answered to men above them in rank. Ordinary hunger could become an offense against royal pleasure. A wounded stag, a jealous court, and a keeper destroyed by lost favor, therefore suited Windsor's darker memory. Herne became every servant whose worth depended upon remaining useful to power. Once rejected, he returned with the forest upon his head and the means of command in his hand. That return carries a peculiar insult towards royalty. The antlers taken from the hunted animal rise above the human hunter. The chain once associated with punishment becomes the instrument by which Herne gathers others. Men who rode freely in life appear bound behind him. Horses belonging to ceremony and sport become mounts for the dead. The park where kings displayed control turns into ground where the crown cannot guarantee safety. Windsor's walls remain visible, though the horned keeper decides who reaches them before morning. People have also treated the hunt as an omen. A horn heard when no hunting party was abroad could announce death within a household, trouble for the country, or change approaching the crown. Such beliefs grew easily around a castle, where illness and political news affected the lives of millions. Staff and soldiers watched flags, messengers, and movements at strange hours. A distant horn from the park during a royal crisis could become inseparable from whatever followed. Years later, memory would preserve the night sound more clearly than the official announcement delivered after dawn. One Windsor story tells of a stable worker who heard hounds gathering during the final illness of a royal resident. The animals under his care became restless before midnight. Several turned their heads toward the same closed door, though nobody stood beyond it. From the park came a horn, followed by the rapid passage of hooves along ground too distant for such clarity. The worker stepped outside. A line of riders crossed the far end of the yard without entering through any gate. Their clothes belonged to earlier reigns, and the leading figure carried antlers above a black horse. The procession stopped beneath the castle walls. Herne looked towards an upper window where one candle remained burning. The chain behind him tightened, and every rider bowed their head. No person appeared at the glass. After several minutes, the candle went out. The hunt turned back towards the park, taking the hounds and hoofbeats with it. News of the death reached the household before morning. The worker later said that the stable horses remained facing the empty window until the first bell rang from the chapel. Stories like that place Herne beside the crown without making him its servant. He watches death cross the guarded threshold and receives whatever the walls can no longer keep. The royal ghosts remain within Windsor because rooms, graves, and rituals hold them. The hunter waits outside for movement in the other direction. A coffin may enter St. George's Chapel, while a shadow leaves by the Long Walk. The chain answers from the trees, and another place opens among riders whose names have been worn away by the journey. This darker role explains why the legend can feel solemn as well as savage. Herne is capable of pursuit, terror, and cruelty, yet the hunt sometimes resembles a funeral procession, denied church, grave, and rest. Its riders travel because they have nowhere else to remain. Their wounds stay open, their uniforms decay without falling away. The hounds cry with human sorrow, and the chain keeps the company together through an endless night. Anyone drawn among them loses solitude, though the price is every freedom that death might have offered. The park can therefore become frightening before Herne is seen. A winter path feels crowded despite appearing empty. Sounds arrive from the wrong distance, with a horse breathing close by while hoofbeats remain far away. Deer stand between the trees and watch people pass without feeding. A smell of extinguished fire drifts across wet ground. The castle lights seem to retreat whenever a walker quickens his pace. Then one old oak gives a small metallic answer from inside the trunk, and the whole legend gathers around that single noise. At Windsor, the chain belongs equally to history and nightmare. Prisoners crossed the castle under guard. Servants lived within strict hierarchies. Soldiers obeyed orders beneath walls carrying royal authority. Herne draws those memories into the forest and removes every uniform distinction. The dead are linked by what happened to them, while the living hear iron before understanding that a place has been prepared among the riders. The fear does not depend upon finding the correct oak or settling the keeper's human identity. It begins whenever the park grows quiet enough for metal to move where no living hand can be found. The first warning may sound almost gentle, one link settling against another beneath the branches. The second carries greater weight. By the third, the noise has crossed the path and stopped behind the witness. The forest then waits for a decision. Those who keep walking towards Windsor may reach the lights. Those who turn towards the chain may see antlers lowering between the trees. Windsor Castle stands at the northern end of that haunted ground, like a promise of walls, lamps, and disciplined human order. The long walk draws the eye towards the round tower in daylight, reducing miles of landscape to a single commanding line. After midnight, the avenue becomes a channel through which anything in the park can face the castle without obstruction. A guard looking south sees mist gather between the trees. Deer step away from the woodland and stand upon the open grass, all turned towards the same unseen point. The park seems to empty itself before the horn is heard. There are nights when the disturbance appears to reach the walls. Windows tremble without wind. Horses in distant buildings become restless. Dogs wake and bark towards the long walk, then fall silent when the chain begins. The sentries remain at their posts. Their discipline gives these accounts much of their force. They are men trained to identify movement, challenge intruders, and endure long hours when attention can become heavy. A figure seen by such a witness has already crossed several habits of observation before being accepted as strange. Consider the castle during a wet winter night, when the public rooms have been closed for hours. Rain lies upon the courtyards, reflecting lamps beneath stone arches. The town below is quiet enough for the river to be heard near the bridge. Staff complete late duties behind private doors. A sentry crosses part of the upper ward and hears a woman's heels strike the floor inside a secured room. A second step follows at a calm interval. The room is meant to be empty. And it is here where we return to the story from the start, which seems so long ago now. The guard waits beside the door while the footsteps travel from the window towards him. Black fabric brushes furniture. A small object gives a metallic ring as the unseen woman passes. The heels stop on the other side of the door. Nothing touches the handle. After several seconds, the steps continue into the corridor without the door opening. The guard sees no body. Reflections within framed glass darken one after another, following the progress of something crossing behind him. At the far end, a portrait catches the full shape of a woman in black. She stands within the reflected corridor, while the real passage remains empty. The guard turns towards the picture. The woman has left the reflection and now occupies the floor beneath it. Her dress carries dull red embroidery, visible only when lightning brightens the windows. Pearls rise through her hair, and the pale face holds the age and severe control seen in the later portraits of Elizabeth I. She looks at the sentry without surprise. Her gaze moves past him towards the castle interior. The heels begin again. Elizabeth walks towards a doorway, her clothing making the faint sound of paper drawn across stone. The guard follows at a respectful distance. She passes through the doorway and enters a room with no second exit. When he reaches it, the woman has gone. Curtains hang still. Furniture remains undisturbed. The far wall is covered by a great hanging, whose surface moves gently in one place, although the room contains no draught. A hand presses from behind the fabric. The fingers move downward, followed by the outline of a woman's face. The mouth opens within the cloth, and a voice asks whether the ships have been sighted. The pressure withdraws before the guard can answer. The hanging settles against the wall. From the corridor comes the sound of a heavy foot. It lands far away, followed by a dragging scrape. The sentry recognizes the rhythm from stories passed quietly among people who know Windsor after closing. Another step arrives. The distance between them shortens. Henry VIII is moving through the dark. The guard leaves the room and looks along the passage. Nothing stands beneath the lamps, though one light dims as the unseen king reaches it. The breathing becomes audible. Each breath seems pulled through a chest under painful weight. A staff or stick touches the floor, then the damaged leg follows. The route passes a window overlooking the ward. Moisture appears upon the inside of the glass in the shape of a broad hand. The guard watches 5 finger marks drag slowly. A face forms in the reflection beside his own, swollen around the cheeks, the eyes small beneath a heavy brow. Henry looks older and more ill than the commanding figure preserved in court portraits. His mouth is open with effort. The guard steps aside. Heat moves past him, carrying the sour sweetness of infected flesh beneath old perfume and wool. The floor answers under invisible weight. Henry's breathing reaches the sentry's ear, remains there for one dreadful moment, then continues towards the chapel. No body appears. Only the shadow of a large man crosses the wall, leaning heavily upon one side. The damaged leg drags through the reflected rainwater outside, even though the sound remains indoors. At the end of the passage, a door opens by itself and closes after the king has gone. The guard stays where he is until the final scrape fades. The fear does not leave with it. Windsor becomes intensely quiet, as though the castle has paused to listen to Henry's progress. Then a male voice begins behind another closed door. The speaker talks rapidly, losing one thought inside the next. Words gather too quickly to understand. The tone shifts between authority, distress, and pleading. The sentry moves closer. A name emerges from the stream of speech, repeated with the aching familiarity of someone calling for a person long absent. The door belongs to a room associated by tradition with George III's final years. The king spent his last decade withdrawn at Windsor, blind, increasingly deaf, and separated from the government conducted in his name. His daughter Amelia had died before him, and grief entered an illness already filled with confusion. In the haunting stories, he sometimes calls for her. The guard hears the name again. A chair scrapes inside the locked room. The voice stops. 3 slow knocks touch the wood from the other side. The sentry unlocks the door and directs light into the chamber. The room is empty. The air carries a medicinal bitterness beneath dust and polish. One chair stands away from the wall, angled towards the window. The glass is dark. As the guard watches, an old man appears beyond it, standing upon the outside ledge several floors above the ground. He wears a long sleeping garment. White hair moves around his face. though the rain passes through him without wetting it. George presses one hand against the pane and looks into the room. His eyes are clouded. He seems unable to see the guard waiting only a few feet away. The mouth moves, asking the same question repeatedly. The words are faint through the glass, though their desperation is unmistakable. He wants to know who has entered, why the room has changed, and where his daughter has gone. The hand upon the pane leaves no mark. The guard approaches. George turns his face towards the sound, and hope passes across it with painful speed. He says Amelia's name. The sentry reaches the window. The ledge is empty. A reflection remains in the glass. George stands behind the guard inside the room, much closer than the space allows. His head leans towards the sentry's shoulder. The old king's lips continue moving, though the voice now comes from beneath the bed. The guard turns. Nobody stands behind him. From the darkness below the frame, fingers appear against the carpet. They belong to an elderly man, trembling as they grip the floor. George's voice pleads for the doors to be kept closed, because someone is coming to take away the crown. The guard backs towards the corridor. The fingers withdraw. A shape moves beneath the bed, too large for the narrow space. The mattress rises as though a body has turned below it. One pale eye opens within the darkness near the floor. Before the sentry can leave, the chapel bell sounds once. The eye closes. The bed settles. The bitter smell disappears from the room, and the voice ends halfway through a word. George's reflection has vanished from the window. The bell is not meant to ring at that hour. Its note travels across the wards and leaves a long vibration in the stone. The guard moves towards St. George's Chapel. Rain has stopped over the lower ward, though water continues falling elsewhere upon the castle. Near the chapel, the air turns sharply cold. A man stands beneath an arch wearing dark 17th century clothing. His hair reaches his shoulders, and the narrow face resembles the portraits of Charles I. He holds one hand against his throat. Charles looks towards the chapel door. Snow begins falling around him. The night remains too mild for it, and no flake touches the courtyard beyond the small circle surrounding the king. White gathers upon his cloak and hair, recalling the snow that covered the pall when his coffin was carried into Windsor after the execution. The burial had been quiet, guarded and stripped of the full Anglican service his supporters wanted. The ghost lowers his head before the closed chapel. Blood appears beneath his fingers and moves in one line around the throat. The guard hears several men walking behind the apparition. Their boots cross the wet stone without bodies. Between them comes the sound of a coffin carried at shoulder height, timber shifting beneath cloth. The unseen procession enters the arch. Charles walks with it. Snow settles upon an invisible rectangular shape behind him, outlining the casket for several seconds. The sentry moves aside. As the cortege passes, cold enters his chest and a smell of damp wool, earth and extinguished candles surrounds him. The chapel door remains closed. Charles reaches it and kneels. His shadow appears upon the stone, though the reflected figure in the wet ground has no head. The king raises both hands. His lips form the beginning of a prayer. A blow sounds from beneath the chapel floor. Charles stops. Another knock follows inside the royal vault, stronger than the first. The unseen coffin behind him answers with a dull impact from within. The guard cannot move. Snow continues covering the kneeling king until his outline becomes a white mound before the door. A third knock travels through the stones. The snow collapses into water. Charles has vanished. The door opens a few inches, revealing darkness within the chapel. No person stands there. The fan vaulting is barely visible overhead, pale ribs disappearing into shadow. The guard calls. His voice returns from the choir with another voice beneath it, lower and much farther away. The reply uses no clear words. It sounds like several people praying under the floor. The sentry enters. His light passes over stools, banners, and memorials. The chapel feels larger at night because darkness removes the limits placed by walls. The aisle appears to continue beyond its usual end. Beneath the choir rests Henry VIII beside Jane Seymour. Elsewhere lie Edward IV, Henry VI, Charles I, George III, and later members of the royal family. The concentration of royal dead gives every step an unbearable weight. A person does not walk through an empty church. He crosses above coffins, bones, and lives remembered in stone. The first knock comes from beneath the choir. A second answers from the royal vault. Another rises near the place associated with Charles. The blows do not form a regular pattern. They sound like separate hands awakening inside separate coffins, each testing the wood around it. The guard shines his light towards the floor. Nothing moves across the stones. The knocking travels nearer, passing below him from one burial place to another. When it reaches the point beneath his boots, every sound stops. Breathing begins in the aisle behind him. It is slow, burdened, and wet. Henry has entered the chapel. The guard does not turn immediately. One heavy foot strikes the stone. The damaged leg follows with a scrape that seems to pull cloth across the grave slab. Henry moves through the choir towards the place where his body lies. A vast shadow reaches along the floor beside him, showing a broad man supported by a staff. The figure has no feet. Its lower edge disappears directly into the stone. The shadow stops above Henry's grave. The breathing deepens. A soft movement rises from below the slab, as though a body has shifted beneath its covering after centuries without space. The guard looks towards the plain stone marking the King and Jane Seymour. Moisture spreads across the inscription. It darkens into the outline of two hands pressed from underneath. One is broad and swollen. The other is smaller, with long fingers reaching towards the edge. The hands remain for several seconds before fading back into dry stone. The unseen king groans. The sound contains pain, anger, and a deep bewilderment at finding no monument above him. His staff strikes once. Dust falls from the vaulting. The chapel banners stir without wind. Henry begins moving around the grave rather than leaving it. Each circuit brings the footsteps closer to the guard. The king's breath passes behind the sentry's neck, then ahead of him, then along the opposite side of the choir. The dragging leg completes another circle. Henry is searching the floor, measuring the modest slab against the magnificence he expected. A woman's heel touches the stone near the west end. Henry stops. The chapel becomes still enough for rainwater to be heard falling outside. Another heel follows. The woman in black enters through the closed door and walks beneath the vaulting. Elizabeth does not approach Henry's grave. She moves along the aisle with her hands folded at the waist, face turned towards the altar. The Queen's figure is fully visible, pale and solid beneath the sentry's light. Her dress reflects no color except a low red glimmer along the sleeves. She reaches a stool and pauses. The carved seat lowers by itself. Elizabeth sits, although the dark skirt passes through the wood. Her gaze remains upon the altar. Henria's breathing resumes near the grave, yet the two presences occupy the chapel without looking towards one another. They appear held within separate memories of the same place. The guard understands that he has entered moments repeating side by side, each ghost bound to a private route invisible to the others. The castle contains them together, while their loneliness remains complete. George III begins speaking beneath the floor. His words come from the royal vault, muffled by stone and distance. He asks for a door to be opened. Another voice answers in a woman's tone too faint to understand. George calls Amelia's name. A hand rises from the darkness between two stools, fingers searching the air. Elizabeth turns her head towards the sound. Her face shows no recognition. The hand withdraws. Somewhere near Charles's burial, a man whispers the opening words of a prayer, then falls silent before completing them. The guard wants to leave, but the chapel door has disappeared into the darkness behind him. Banners hang where the exit should be. Their embroidered arms move as though seen beneath water. Figures appear below them, first as pale vertical shapes and then as men and women standing shoulder to shoulder. Some wear crowns, others carry the clothes of attendants, soldiers and children. They do not advance. Every face turns towards the guard with the patient attention of a congregation waiting for him to begin. He knows only one response. The sentry removes his cap, lowers his head and speaks the Lord's Prayer. His voice trembles at first, then steadies beneath the familiar words. Elizabeth bows her head. Henry's breathing slows. George stops calling from the vault. The figures beneath the banners close their eyes. Charles continues the prayer from somewhere near the chapel door. The final words rise into the fan vaulting and return as a whisper from every part of the church. When the prayer ends, the chapel bell rings. The sound is immense inside the enclosed space. The pale congregation fades from the stalls. Elizabeth's seat rises after her figure disappears. The handprints upon Henry's slab withdraw. George's voice gives one final sigh below the floor. The chapel door returns at the west end, partly open to the wet courtyard. The guard stands alone beneath the banners. His light has regained its strength. A thin line of snow lies before the entrance where Charles had knelt. The sentry steps outside, mist covers the long walk beyond the walls. Deer are moving across the open ground in a single silent herd, leaving the southern trees behind. The animals gather where the castle can be seen clearly, then stop and look back. A hunting horn sounds from within the park. Its note passes through the mist and reaches Windsor, with enough force to tremble in the chapel windows. The guard turns towards the avenue. Antlers rise above the fog at the farthest visible point. Herne stands upon the long walk. The distance should make the figure impossible to distinguish, yet the horned outline remains exact. A horse waits beneath him. Behind the rider, darker forms gather among the trees, extending across the avenue and into the woodland on both sides. The chain moves through them with a low metallic murmur. Hounds call once. Every deer near the castle lowers itself to the ground. The guard hears another sentry challenge the distant figure, though no human voice could carry far enough to receive an answer. Herne raises the horn. Before he sounds it, bells begin ringing across Windsor. The first belongs to St. George's Chapel. Others answer from the town below, joined by clocks marking the approaching morning. The notes overlap above roofs, wards, and river. Herne remains upon the avenue while the mist thins around him. His riders fade first. Horses become tree trunks, pale faces become patches of sky, and the chain sinks into the frost. The hounds disappear among the deer without disturbing them. Herne is the last shape left. He turns his head towards the round tower. The flag above it begins to emerge in the grey light. For a moment, the antlers and tower share the same sky, the old forest keeper facing the royal walls that gave his legend a home. Then the horse steps backwards into mist. Herne lowers the horn and vanishes. The place where he stood remains dark until sunrise reaches the avenue. The deer rise together and return slowly to the grass. Morning enters Windsor by degrees. The eastern sky pales above the Thames. Chimneys and rooftops become distinct below the castle. Delivery vehicles move through streets where the lamps are still burning. A train arrives with light in its windows and only a few passengers upon the platform, and everything was as it was before. Windsor stands to this day and may stand long after you or I take our final breath. Many of these stories have grown from eyewitness accounts passed down by guards, workers, and visitors over the decades. Others belong to the ever-growing folklore surrounding the castle, shaped by centuries of history, memory, and fear. Thank you for listening tonight. I hope I have kept you company. Good night and sleep well.